Welcome back to the quiet apothecary. Take a slow breath, let your shoulders drop, and settle into wherever you happen to be resting tonight. There is nothing here that asks anything of you, and nowhere else you need to be for the next few hours. Tonight we do not walk out to the hedgerow with a basket, nor grind roots at the stillroom bench by candlelight. Tonight we step, quietly and with a great deal of respect, into the warmest and most private room a medieval village ever kept, the birthing chamber, and we sit for a while with the women who governed it, chief among them the midwife, the woman called for at any hour to help a neighbor bring a new life safely into the world. 100 quiet facts about her craft, her chamber, the herbs of her birth stool, the charms she laid upon a laboring woman, and the long, careful weeks that followed, all gathered together and offered slowly, a small handful at a time, in gentle chapters. Imagine, if you will, a low room in a village house on a cold night. The shutters are closed, the keyhole stopped with a twist of cloth, and a good fire burns steadily in the hearth. Fresh rushes cover the floor. Clean linen is folded ready on a chest, and the best candle in the house has been lit and set where it will do the most good. The room is full of women, and no man among them. This is where we will spend our whole evening, in the warmth and the low golden light, listening to what these women knew. There is no need to remember any of this. Let your attention come and go exactly as it pleases. We have a great many hours ahead of us, and a great many quiet facts still to come, and not one of them will mind in the least if you drift off partway through and meet the rest only in the morning, or not at all. Let us begin with the woman herself, and the many names her neighbors gave her. The word we use most often now, midwife, is among the oldest and the plainest of them all, and it means simply the woman who is with the mother, the one who stands beside her through the whole of it. In the French lands she was the sage, femme, the wise woman, and in the German lands the hebamme, a word old enough that its exact roots are still gently argued over by scholars today. In parts of Scotland and the north of England, she was the howdy, or the howdy wife, and in Italy the commère, a word that folded godmother and neighbor together into one. Whatever the tongue, the shape of the name kept returning to the same two ideas, wisdom and nearness, the woman who knew and the woman who came. It is worth pausing on how tender most of these names are. There is no word among them for a stranger, no cold title borrowed from a distant office or a guild. She was named, everywhere, as a kind of kin, a woman close enough to a household's most private hour to be spoken of almost as family. In many parishes the same word served for the midwife and for the child's godmother, so that the woman who first held a newborn and the woman who answered for its soul at the font might be, and sometimes truly were, one and the same person. That doubling tells us something about her place. She was not called in the way one calls a workman to a broken wall. She was received, welcomed into the house at its most vulnerable, and the very words used for her carried, quietly, the expectation that she would be gentle and known, and trusted long after the night itself was over. Let us turn now to who she tended to be, in her age and her experience. Almost everywhere in medieval Europe, the midwife was an older woman, very often past her own childbearing years, a matron settled and steady in her village. This was no accident. A woman came to the work slowly, across decades, and the years themselves were held to be a kind of qualification, proof that she had seen a great deal and been trusted through all of it. She had, in nearly every case, borne children of her own, and had usually buried some of them, for that was the hard arithmetic of the age, and this too was counted as knowledge no book could give. A young woman at a birth was there to learn, to fetch, and to hold. The woman at the head of the bed, giving the quiet orders and reading the long hours, was grey, and her grey hair was itself a comfort. Her very slowness was part of what she brought into the room. She had, her neighbours understood, done this many times before, on nights far worse than this one, and here she still was unhurried, laying out her clean cloth by the fire, as though there were all the time in the world. There is something reassuring in this to a modern listener. The idea that the most frightening hour of a family's year was placed, deliberately, into the hands of the oldest and calmest woman they knew. Youth was not what they wanted at a bedside. They wanted someone who had already outlived 100 such nights, and would, God willing, outlive this one too. Let us turn now to where she stood among her neighbours. The midwife held a standing in her community that sat, in a curious way, somewhere between the priest and the healer, touching a little of the authority of each. Like the priest, she was present at one of the two great thresholds of every human life, and like the wise woman who cured fevers, she carried a store of practical, hard-won knowledge. But her particular room, the birth chamber, was one that neither the priest nor the physician was permitted to enter, and this gave her an authority that was entirely and unusually her own. For those long hours she was, quite simply, in charge, and everyone in the house understood it, from the labouring woman to the frightened husband, kept waiting on the far side of the door. When she asked for more hot water, it came. When she said the time had come to move to the stool, or that there was no cause yet for haste, her words settled the room. Few women of the medieval world held that kind of plain, uncontested command over a household, even briefly, and she held it by right of knowledge alone. Yet this standing was earned rather than granted, birth after birth, across many years, and it could be quietly lost as well, if a run of hard outcomes turned a community's trust the other way. The good midwife understood this better than anyone, and it shaped how carefully she worked. She was not called upon to be bold. She was called upon to be steady, and to be right often enough, over a long enough life, that the next frightened family would send for her without a second thought. Let us turn now to how she was paid for all of this. Payment for a midwife was rarely a simple matter of coin, especially in a poorer village, and it followed the same soft economy that governed most country dealings. A wealthier family might pay her a proper fee in money, agreed beforehand and handed over at the churching. A poorer one paid in whatever it had, a measure of grain, a length of homespun cloth, a laying hen, a day's help brought to her own harvest, or simply a place kept warm for her at the fire, and a share of whatever the house could cook. In many places a small gift was expected some weeks after the birth, once mother and child were safely through the dangerous early days, a final token of thanks folded quietly into the celebration. What almost never happened, at least where the work was properly understood, was that a woman in labour was turned away for want of means. The custom of the craft, and in later centuries the very oath the midwife swore, held that she must attend the poor as readily as the rich, and take from each only what each could give. A record survives here and there of a single woman's name, set against nearly every birth in a parish across a stretch of years, paid sometimes in silver and sometimes in eggs, and evidently never keeping too strict an account of the difference between them. She was, in the plainest sense, part of how the village looked after itself, and payment was less a fee than a shared understanding that she would be seen right in return. Let us turn now to her own place in the household, as wife or as widow. In most regions, a midwife was expected to be, or to have been, a married woman, and very often she was a widow by the time she took up the work in earnest. This expectation had less to do with the medicine than with the trust. A married or widowed woman of middle years was a known quantity in her parish, settled, respectable, unlikely to be the subject of loose talk herself, and this steadiness of reputation was considered nearly as important as any skill of the hands. The birth chamber held a great many secrets, and a family wanted them held by someone whose own life gave no one cause to gossip. Her married past was also, quietly, part of her credential. She had stood where the laboring woman now stood, more than once, and had come through it and out the other side. When she said, in the small dark hours, that all was going as it should, and there was no cause for fear, the reassurance carried a weight it could never have had from an unmarried girl who had only ever watched from the corner of the room. She spoke, in those moments, not merely as an attendant, but as one woman to another, from inside the very same experience, and the laboring woman heard it that way. There is an old, unwritten authority in being able to say, I have felt exactly this, and it will pass, and it did for me. That authority a midwife could only earn by having lived it herself. Let us turn now to the matter of her character, which mattered more than almost anything. Above skill, and above even experience, the quality most often demanded of a midwife was simply that she be of good character, a woman of, as the old phrasing had it, honest life and sober conversation. The reasons were deeply practical, rather than merely moral. She was admitted to the most intimate hours of a family's life, and trusted with matters of birth and paternity, and legitimacy that could shape inheritances and reputations for a whole generation. A gossiping or a dishonest midwife was not merely unpleasant to have about. She was dangerous, and a village guarded against her the way it guarded against a leaking roof. Discretion, then, was not an extra virtue laid on top of the work, but a central part of the trade itself. What was said and seen in the birth chamber stayed there, sealed as surely as anything a priest heard, and a midwife's name for keeping it so was built as slowly and held as carefully as her name for skill. A single loose word, carried out of that room and into the lane, could undo a reputation that had taken 30 years to make. In more than one later account, the highest praise given to a remembered midwife is not that she saved this life or eased that labor, but simply that she could be trusted entirely with anything at all. It is a quiet kind of tribute, and in her world it was very nearly the highest one a woman could be paid. Let us turn now to a quieter part of her work, the one that lay at the far end of life. In a great many villages, the woman who brought children into the world was also the woman who prepared the dead to leave it. The same steady hands that first washed and swaddled a newborn would, when the time came, wash and wrap a neighbor for the grave. This pairing was not thought strange or grim in the least. Both were understood as women's work, quiet and necessary, performed at the two great thresholds that a household could not cross on its own, and it seemed only natural that the same trusted, experienced woman should stand at each of them. There is something whole and unbroken in this, that a modern listener might find unexpectedly gentle. The person who greeted a life at its first breath, and the person who tended a body at its last were, so often, one and the same, moving between cradle and grave across a lifetime in the same parish, holding both ends of the single thread. She had seen more beginnings and more endings than anyone else in the village, and she carried them without any apparent sense of contradiction. Perhaps it even made her calmer at the bedside, this long familiarity with both doors. She knew, as few others did, how fragile the whole passage was, and how often, all the same, it came right. She was, in the fullest sense the word can hold, the keeper of her village's thresholds, and she wore the double duty as plainly as she wore her apron. Let us turn now to how a woman came to hold such knowledge in the first place. There were, for most of the medieval centuries, almost no schools for this, and certainly none that would have admitted a village woman. She learned, instead, the way nearly all women's crafts were learned, at the bedside by attending. A younger woman went along with an established midwife, first simply to watch, to fetch warm water, to lend a steady arm, and only slowly, across many births, to do more. She might attend for years before she was trusted to receive a child herself. In that long, unhurried apprenticeship, she absorbed 1,000 small judgments that no one could have written down even if anyone had thought to try. This was learning of the oldest and slowest kind, passed from hand to hand rather than from page to eye, and a great deal of it never took the form of words at all. It lived in the way an experienced woman's fingers came to know, without her quite thinking about it, how a labor was progressing, or when to be patient, and when to grow quietly watchful. That kind of knowledge could only be caught, never simply taught, and catching it took the better part of a working life. By the time a woman was ready to work alone, she had usually spent 20 years or more at the elbow of someone older, and had folded that whole long watching into a set of instincts she could no longer have explained aloud if she tried. Let us turn now to the hardest and most personal part of her schooling. For most midwives, the first true teacher was not another woman at all, but her own body. Having borne children herself, usually several, she had felt from the inside the whole slow architecture of a labor, its long patient hours and its sudden urgent ones, its fear and its enormous relief. When she knelt before another woman in the same hour, she was drawing not only on everything she had watched across the years, but on everything she had lived through in her own flesh. She knew what the laboring woman was feeling, because she had felt it, and this gave her reassurances a depth that no purely learned skill could ever match. It is a sobering thought that the age's finest teacher of childbirth was childbirth itself, survived and remembered, again and again in the body of the very woman now giving the quiet orders. Every midwife carried within her the memory of her own hard nights, and it made her, at the bedside, both more careful and more kind. When she pressed a warm cloth to a straining back, or said softly that this part was always the worst and would soon be over, she spoke from a place the woman on the birth stool recognized at once and trusted without needing to be told why. That shared, wordless understanding was among the most powerful medicines she carried, and it cost her nothing but her own remembered pain. Let us turn now to the way this knowledge traveled down the generations. More often than not, midwifery ran in families, passed from a mother to a daughter, or from an aunt to a niece, along the same private channels that carried every other domestic skill. A girl grew up watching her mother rise at odd hours and take up her cloth and go out into the dark, and grew used, long before she understood any of it, to the strange rhythms of the work. In time she went along to help, and in time she took it up herself, so that a single village might be served by 3 or 4 generations of the same family across 100 years. This inheritance was as much of temperament as of technique. A daughter learned not only which herb eased an after pain, but how to be in a frightened room, how to lower her voice and slow her hands, and let her own calm spread outward until it filled the whole space. That steadiness, handed down mother to daughter across the generations, was in the end the most valuable thing any of them possessed, and the very hardest to set down in any book. Each woman in such a line added her own small refinement before passing the whole of it on. A slightly better way to ease a particular pain, a herb she had come to trust above another, a phrase that seemed to settle a laboring woman more than the old one had. The tradition was not frozen. It grew, gently, in the hands of every woman who held it, and reached its final daughter richer than it had left its first mother. Let us turn now to how such knowledge was kept safe in an age when so few could write. Because the great majority of midwives could neither read nor write, almost all of what they knew was held in memory alone, and shaped, as memory likes to be shaped, into rhyme and saying and repeated phrase. A remedy fixed into a short verse was a remedy that could survive the years, carried mouth to ear through a whole lifetime and handed on intact. The order of a task, the signs to watch for, the words to speak over a difficult moment, all of it lived in this soft oral architecture, rehearsed so many hundreds of times that it needed no page at all to keep it whole. We should not mistake this for a poor or a fragile way of holding knowledge. An oral tradition of this kind, tested constantly against real births and corrected without mercy by hard experience, could be remarkably exact and remarkably durable, in some ways steadier than a single fragile manuscript that a fire or a flood might take in an hour. Certain phrases and practices recur so consistently across regions and centuries that historians now believe they preserve something very close to the midwife's own words, carried down unwritten for longer than most written books survive. It is a strange and gentle thought that some of what we will hear tonight may reach us in almost the exact shape it was first spoken, worn smooth by 1,000 quiet repetitions in 1,000 darkened rooms. Let us turn now to the rare occasions when that knowledge did reach the page. For all that the tradition lived in memory, a handful of written works did circulate, and slowly grew more common toward the close of the Middle Ages. Chief among the printed ones was a German book of the early 16th century, A Garden of Roses for Pregnant Women and Midwives, as its title had it, which gathered older learning into plain instruction and was carried in translation across Europe within a generation. Its English version was given the gentle name of The Birth of Mankind, and became the first printed book on the subject in the language. These books leaned heavily on far older sources, some reaching back to the ancient physicians of the Mediterranean world, their advice copied and recopied for 1,000 years before ever meeting a printing press. There is a quiet irony in them, seldom remarked upon. The knowledge was women's knowledge, gathered across centuries of birth chambers, yet the men who now set it into type had, for the most part, never been inside one. They wrote at second hand, from the old texts and from what women told them. A working midwife might go her whole life without seeing such a book, or being able to read it if she did. But their slow spread marked the first faint turning of a very long change, the moment at which a knowledge that had always lived in women's memory began, cautiously, to be written down at all, and so to reach us now. Let us turn now to the most famous name attached to any of it, Trotula of Salerno. In the southern Italian town of Salerno, home to the most celebrated medical school of the earlier medieval world, there gathered a body of writing on women's medicine that traveled, for centuries afterward, under the single name Trotula. It covered the whole arc of a woman's health, the troubles of the body, the care of pregnancy, the conduct of a birth, and the tending of a newborn, and it was copied into manuscript after manuscript across the whole of Europe, one of the most widely read medical works of its age. For a long time scholars doubted whether any real woman stood behind the name, but the weight of opinion has slowly turned, and historians now generally accept that a woman physician, a certain Trotula of Salerno, truly lived and taught and wrote there in the 12th century. Her work later folded together with others under the familiar title. If that is so, she is among the very few named women of the whole medieval medical tradition to reach us in her own right. What makes her matter to our evening is less the detail of any single remedy than the plain fact of her. Here, at least once, the knowledge of the birth chamber was written by a woman who knew it from the inside, set down in her own hand, and kept safe long enough to survive. For every Trota whose name we have, there were 100,000 village midwives whose names we will never know, and she stands, in a sense, for all of them. Let us turn now to the way a woman was truly recognized as a midwife. Whatever the record said, long before any bishop thought to license her, and in most places long after, a woman became the midwife of her parish by the simplest means imaginable. The women of the village kept calling for her and kept being satisfied. No paper conferred this, and no examination could. It grew slowly out of a run of births attended and come safely through, until one day it was simply understood, without anyone quite deciding it, that she was the woman one sent for when a neighbor's time drew near. This quiet, unofficial license, granted by the confidence of other women, was in practice the only one that mattered to most families. A midwife might hold a bishop's paper and still find the women preferred another, older and more trusted, down the lane. Or she might hold no paper at all and yet attend every birth for miles, because the mothers of the district would have no one else near them at their hour. It is worth remembering, through everything that follows tonight about oaths and licenses, and the interest of the church, that beneath all of it lay this older and softer authority, woman choosing woman. The men who wrote the rules came late to arrangement that the women of the villages had been quietly managing among themselves in their own way. for a very long time already. Let us turn now to the moment the wider world began to take an official interest in her. Toward the close of the Middle Ages, and more firmly in the century or so that followed, the Church began to take a formal interest in who the midwives were, and in England and parts of the continent, the bishops took upon themselves the licensing of them. A woman might be brought before the bishop's officer, sometimes with the testimony of matrons she had served, and there examined as to her skill, her character, and above all her faith, before being granted leave to practice. The reasons for this interest were not, in the main, about the medicine at all. The Church cared chiefly about two things. It cared that a midwife could, in an emergency, baptize a dying child correctly, a matter of the infant's very soul. And it cared that she was not, as the fearful language of the age sometimes had it, given to sorcery or to concealing births that ought to be known. The license, in other words, was as much a spiritual and a moral instrument as a medical one. For the ordinary midwife, this new oversight sat a little oddly beside her daily work, which went on much as it always had. But it left us something precious all the same, because the Church wrote these licenses down and kept the oaths and the examinations in its registers. A great many midwives who would otherwise have vanished entirely have left us at least their names, and the plain fact that they lived and worked and were trusted. Let us turn now to the oath itself and the solemn words she was made to speak. Where a midwife was licensed, she was very often required to swear an oath, administered by the bishop or his deputy, before God and the Church, binding her to conduct her work in certain ways. Several such oaths survive in the diocesan records of the later medieval and early modern period, and they are, read now, a strangely moving document, for they show us exactly what her communities most hoped for from her, and most feared in her. The oath was no light matter to the woman who swore it. She spoke it in a sacred setting, calling God to witness, and in a world that took such vows with the utmost seriousness. To break it was not merely to risk the loss of her license, but, as she understood it, to imperil her own soul. Whatever we may make now of the particular clauses, she carried them into every birth chamber she entered, a set of promises kept in the back of her mind through all the long, dark hours. We will walk through the chief of those promises one at a time, gently, for each opens a small window onto the hopes and the anxieties of the age. They tell us less about medicine than about trust, about what a village needed to believe of the woman it admitted to its most private room, and about the fears, some reasonable and some not, that gathered around her work. Let us turn now to the first of the oath's promises, to serve rich and poor alike. The midwife swore, in nearly every version of the oath that survives, that she would be ready to help any woman in labor, whether rich or poor, and that she would not, for the sake of a greater fee, hurry away from a humble house to attend a wealthier one. She promised to come when called, by day or by night, in fair weather or foul, and to give the poor woman the same care, and the same patience she would give the lady of the manor. This clause tells us that the temptation it guarded against was real. A midwife's time was finite, and a night could hold more than one birth, and the pull of the paying house against the penniless one must sometimes have been a genuine and painful thing. The oath set its face firmly against it, and bound her before God to a kind of equality at the bedside that the world outside the birth chamber rarely practiced anywhere else. There is something quietly admirable in this, whatever the age's other harshnesses. For a few hours, in that warm dark room, the cottager's wife and the lord's lady were owed the same steady hands and the same unhurried care, and the woman who tended them had sworn a holy oath to make no difference between them. It was one of the very few places in the medieval world where such a promise was even made, let alone kept. Let us turn now to the gravest of the oath's promises concerning the child itself. The midwife swore that she would not conceal a birth, and that she would never, on any account, substitute one child for another. To a modern ear, these are strange and even alarming clauses, but each answered a specific fear of the age. The promise not to conceal a birth was aimed at the hiding of illegitimate children, and at the darker crime of infanticide, matters in which the midwife, as the one present, was the natural and only witness. She was bound to bring such births into the light. The promise never to exchange a living child for a dead one, or one infant for another, guarded against a fear that ran deep in a world where inheritance was everything. A great house without an heir, it was darkly imagined, might be tempted to have a living child slipped in place of a stillborn one, and only the midwife could have managed such a thing, or prevented it. So she swore expressly that she never would, and in swearing it acknowledged the frightening trust her position carried. She swore, too, that if she could, she would learn and truthfully report the name of the child's father, a matter of legitimacy, of inheritance, and of the parish's reluctance to be left supporting a child no man would own. These were heavy responsibilities to lay upon a woman already managing the whole physical labor of a birth, and they remind us how much more than medicine her presence in that room was understood to mean. Let us turn now to the clause that sat most uneasily beside her actual practice. The midwife also swore, in most versions of the oath, that she would use no sorcery, no witchcraft, no charms or incantations contrary to the teaching of the Church in the conduct of her work. This was the age's anxiety speaking plainly. The birth chamber was a place of mystery and danger, sealed off from men, governed by women whose knowledge no cleric fully understood, and the fear that something unholy might go on. There was never far beneath the surface. The difficulty, which the oath itself seems half to acknowledge, is that a great deal of ordinary, accepted birth chamber practice sat very close to the line the oath drew. The prayers spoken over a laboring woman, the girdles blessed by the Church and laid upon her belly, the holy candles lit and the saints invoked, all of these were charms of a kind, tolerated and even encouraged so long as they wore a Christian face. The line between a permitted prayer and a forbidden charm was fine indeed, and shifted with the temper of the times. Most midwives, one imagines, kept the oath in the letter and lived quietly across its spirit, using the small blessings and comforts their mothers had used, as the Church itself in gentler moods used its relics and its holy waters. We will come, later in our evening, to those charms and girdles in their own right, for they were among the most tender and human of all her tools, whatever the oath made her swear. Let us turn now to her single priest-like power, the baptizing of a dying child. Of everything the Church required of the midwife, none was weightier than this. If a newborn seemed in danger of dying before a priest could be fetched, She was not only permitted, but commanded to baptize it herself, then and there, with water and the proper words. In an age that believed an unbaptized child was shut out from heaven, this was no small thing. For those few urgent moments, an ordinary village woman held in her hands a power the church otherwise reserved to its ordained men. Because the words had to be exactly right for the baptism to be valid, midwives were carefully instructed in them and sometimes examined to be sure they had them by heart. She had to name the child, pour or sprinkle the water, and speak the naming of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in the correct form. A baptism bungled in the panic of the moment was, in the theology of the age, no baptism at all, and so she rehearsed the words until they were as sure in her mouth as any prayer. It is a striking image to hold, this grey village woman, unlettered, holding a failing infant in the firelight, and speaking over it the very words that a bishop would speak, with the same effect in the eyes of the church. In that one instant her authority reached past medicine and past custom into the sacred itself, and the whole weight of it rested, as so much did, on her steadiness and her memory. Let us turn now to the strange places her testimony was called for out in the wider world of law. Because the midwife was so often the only reliable witness to matters of the body that the law cared deeply about, she found herself, from time to time, drawn out of the birth chamber and into the business of the courts. When a woman condemned to death claimed to be with child, and so to be spared until after her delivery, it was a jury of matrons, led by experienced midwives, who were charged with examining her and giving their verdict. On their word, quite literally, a life might turn. She was called upon, too, in questions of paternity. It was widely held that a woman in the extremity of hard labor would not lie, and so a midwife might gently press a laboring woman to name the father of her child, and her report of what was said carried real weight afterward in matters of legitimacy and support. In cases where a newborn had died in doubtful circumstances, it was again the midwife's examination and her judgment of whether a child had been born living that the law leaned upon. These were grave duties to fold in among the herbs and the warm cloths, and they show how far the trust placed in her extended. The same woman who eased an after pain at midnight might be asked, in daylight, to give the testimony on which a court would hang its judgment, and her long reputation for honesty was, in those moments, the only guarantee anyone had. Let us turn now, away from oaths and courts, into the chamber itself, and the care with which it was made ready. When a woman's time drew near, a room in the house was prepared for her, set aside and made ready as the lying in chamber where she would give birth and afterward keep to her bed. In a poor cottage this might be the single main room, cleared and warmed as best it could be. In a wealthier house a whole chamber was given over to it, and among the great, hung with the finest cloth the family owned, the walls, and even the bed, dressed in the best textiles, for the room would be seen by many visiting women in the weeks to come. A store of special linen was gathered and set ready, sheets and swaddling bands and clean cloths, some of it kept from birth to birth as a household's childbed linen, laundered and folded away between times. Everything the long hours might call for was laid in beforehand, so that once the labor began no one need go searching. The room was made, in a sense, into a small world of its own, provisioned and enclosed. that could sustain the women inside it through a night or two without recourse to the house. Beyond, this careful readying was itself a kind of comfort. To prepare the chamber was to take the frightening unknown of a birth and give it a shape, a place, a set of familiar objects arranged in a familiar order. By the time the first pains came, the woman entered a room already waiting for her, warm and stocked and quiet, and that alone must have steadied many a laboring heart before ever a herb was brewed or a charm laid. Let us turn now to the warmth and the darkness kept so carefully within it. The birth chamber was, above all, kept warm and kept dark. The shutters were closed, and the windows often hung with cloth. The keyhole itself sometimes stopped with a twist of rag, and every draught that could be found was blocked. Part of this was the plain sense of the age about warmth, and about what was then called bad or corrupt air, thought to trouble both mother and child. And part of it reached towards something older, a wish to seal the room against whatever ill influence or restless spirit the dark outside might carry. The result was a close, dim, golden little world, lit by fire and candle rather than by day, warm to the point of stuffiness by our reckoning, and utterly enclosed. Within it the ordinary markers of time softened and fell away. Whether it was noon or midnight, beyond the shuttered window, mattered very little to the women inside, who measured the hours instead by the progress of the labor and the burning down of the candles. There is a reason so many later memories of being born, or of attending a birth, return to this particular quality of enclosed, fire-lit warmth. The chamber was designed, deliberately, to hold the world at bay, to make of itself a soft and defended place at the very hour a family was most exposed to fear. Whatever we make now of stopped keyholes and blocked windows, the instinct beneath them, to gather close and shut out the cold dark, is one any of us can still feel. Let us turn now to the fire that was never allowed to go out. At the heart of the warm chamber burned a fire that was kept alive, without fail, through the whole of the labor and the long lying in that followed. It warmed the room, it heated the endless water the work required, and it gave the whole space its steady, living light. To let it fail was unthinkable, and so someone was always charged with feeding it, keeping the water hot and the room warm through even the smallest hours of the night. Warm water was needed at every turn, for washing, for the fomentations and warm cloths pressed against a laboring back, for the first bathing of the child, for the countless small offices of the birth. A cold hearth would have meant cold water, and cold water in a birth chamber was thought not merely uncomfortable, but dangerous, an invitation to the chills and fevers that shadowed every childbed. So the fire was tended as carefully as the mother herself. There is something fitting in the fire, standing at the center of it all, this oldest of household comforts, pressed into the service of the oldest of human events. Around it the whole chamber arranged itself, the women drawing close, the water warming, the light rising and falling on the walls, and at the middle of everything the laboring woman, held within a ring of warmth that the midwife would not let fail until her work was safely done. Let us turn now to the floor of the chamber, and the fresh rushes strewn across it. Over the floor of the birth room, as over the floors of most medieval houses, were strewn fresh rushes, cut from a nearby stream or marsh and laid down in a soft, sweet-smelling layer. For a birth, the old rushes were swept away and new ones brought in, and among them were often scattered fragrant strewing herbs, meadowsweet and lavender and sweet flag, so that the room smelled green and clean, and the whole floor became, in effect, a soft and renewable carpet that could be swept out and replaced as the long hours required. Upon and beside this fresh floor was laid the household's best linen, brought out and made ready. Clean sheets, soft cloths, and the swaddling bands for the child were gathered and set within easy reach. Some of it, the family's finest, kept for exactly such occasions and laundered carefully away between them. A woman of any means at all wanted her childbed dressed in the best she owned, both for the comfort of it and because, in the weeks to come, a great many visiting women would see the room and remember how it looked. There was a quiet dignity in this preparing of the floor and the linen, a way of honoring the event by making its setting as fresh and as fine as the house could manage. However humble the cottage, the birth chamber was, for a little while, its most carefully tended room, swept and strewn and dressed with a care that the daily business of the house rarely received. Let us turn now to who was, very firmly, kept out of it. The birth chamber was a wholly female world, and men had no place inside it. The husband, whatever his rank, waited elsewhere in the house, or at a neighbor's, or paced the yard, kept firmly on the far side of the door, and told little of what passed within. The physician, in the rare cases where one might be involved at all, generally advised from outside and did not enter. For the whole duration of the labor, the room belonged to the women alone. This exclusion of men was near universal and deeply held. Childbirth was women's mystery and women's business, tended by women's hands, witnessed by women's eyes. And a man crossing that threshold would have been thought not merely out of place, but very nearly improper. The knowledge, the care, and the authority within that room were female through and through, and the closed door marked the boundary of a domain in which, for once, women answered only to one another. We might spare a thought for the husband waiting beyond that door, for his part in the night was its own small ordeal of helplessness. He could do nothing but wait, and listen and hope, kept out of the one room in his own house where the thing he cared about most was being decided. Custom gave him no role at all but patience, and the first he usually knew of how it had gone was the thin cry of a child, or the quiet opening of the door, and the face of a woman coming to tell him. Let us turn now to the holy things gathered about the room. Alongside the linen and the warm water, the birth chamber was very often provided with a store of holy objects, set out to guard and comfort mother and child. A candle blessed by the church, sometimes one kept from the Feast of Candlemas earlier in the year, might be lit and kept burning through the labor. Holy water was sprinkled, and small images or tokens of the saints most concerned with childbirth were set, where the laboring woman could see them. These sacred things sat easily beside the herbs and the practical work, all of a piece in the mind of the age, which drew no sharp line between the medicine of the body and the care of the soul. A woman in labor faced real danger, and it seemed only sensible to bring to her side every help that could be had, the warm cloth and the blessed candle together, the raspberry, leaf tea and the whispered prayer, each doing its own part in easing her through. The presence of these holy objects also gathered the great event of the birth into the larger story the whole village believed itself to be living within. This was not merely a woman in pain in a dark room. It was a soul about to enter the world, watched over by its saints. And the small blessed things arranged about the chamber said as much, quietly, to everyone who had gathered there to help. Let us turn now to the food and drink laid in against the long hours. A labor could run for a day or more, and the women attending it needed sustenance as surely as the mother did. So a store of food and drink was gathered into the chamber against the long watch. Chief among these was the girdle, a warm, nourishing drink of ale or wine thickened with eggs, sweetened and spiced with whatever the household could afford, ginger or cinnamon or saffron among the better off. It was warming, strengthening, and easy to take, and it was offered to the laboring woman in small sips, and to her attendants to keep them going. Alongside the girdle there might be simple, sustaining things, bread and cheese, spiced ale, and special cakes baked for the occasion, so that the whole long vigil took on, amid its labor and its worry, something of the character of a shared gathering. The women ate and drank together as they waited and worked, and this sharing of warm food in a warm room was itself part of the comfort the chamber offered. There is a homeliness in this that softens the whole picture of a medieval birth. However anxious the hours, they were passed among familiar women, over familiar food, in the warmest room of the house, with a spiced drink warming on the hearth. The girdle in particular became so bound up with childbirth in the popular mind that to offer someone a girdle came, in time, to mean simply to wish them the comfort due to one recovering from a great effort. Let us turn now to the women who gathered there, and the old word for them. The women who came to attend a birth were known, in English, as the gossips, and the word, before it ever meant idle talk, meant something warm and specific. It came from God Sib, a relation in God, and named the woman's chosen female companions and sponsors, the ones bound to her and to her child by the ties of God-parenthood and neighborly love. To be a woman's gossip was an honor and a duty, and she chose them with care, for they were the women who would surround her at her most vulnerable hour. That the word later curdled into a term for careless chatter tells its own small story about how the wider world came to regard these gatherings of women. What had been a name for a sacred and supportive bond became, in less generous mouths, a byword for women talking among themselves, as though that talk could only be trifling. But in its first and truest sense, a gossip was a woman you trusted to hold you through the worst night of your life, and to keep, forever after, what she saw there. It is worth reclaiming the word, if only for the length of our evening. The gossips were the laboring woman's chosen circle, her friends and kinswomen and neighbors, gathered by her own invitation into the sealed warmth of the chamber, and their presence was among the greatest comforts the whole custom of childbirth provided. She did not labor alone. She labored surrounded, held on every side by women who had chosen to be there. Let us turn now to the duty and the reciprocity of attending. To attend a neighbor's birth was understood as a social duty freely given and quietly owed. A woman who came to sit with you through your labor did so knowing that, in her own hour, you would come and sit with her. This web of mutual attendance bound the women of a parish together in one of the deepest of all their shared obligations, a reciprocity measured not in coin, but in presence. in nights given and nights returned across the whole span of their childbearing years. There was practical wisdom in the custom as well as warmth. The more women present, the more hands to help, to fetch and warm and hold, and the more experience gathered in one room, so that if the midwife needed counsel or a second pair of skilled hands, they were close by. A birth was too large a thing to be managed by one woman alone. And the community answered that need by simply turning out, as a matter of course, whenever a neighbor's time had come. This turning out for one another was among the strongest threads of village life, and it fell almost entirely to the women. In an age with little else to soften its hardships, the certainty that you would not be left to labor alone, that the women of your parish would gather to you unasked, was a real and considerable comfort, one repaid, birth after birth, across a lifetime of shared thresholds. Let us turn now to the plain physical work the gathered women did. The gossips were not merely present. They worked, and much of the hard bodily labor of supporting the mother fell to them. In the earlier stages they walked her about the room, up and down, hour upon hour, for movement was thought to help the labor along, and it was easier borne on another's arm. They rubbed her back and her sides. They held her hands, and let her grip theirs through the pains, and when the time came they held and braced her body as she bore down. In the upright births that were then the custom, a strong woman might sit behind the laboring mother and take her whole weight, becoming for those hours a kind of living chair, arms wrapped about her, breathing with her, absorbing the strain of each effort. It was exhausting work, and the women spelled one another at it, so that fresh strength was always there to support the one giving birth. The mother, in the hardest moments, was quite literally held up by the bodies of her friends. There is a plain tenderness in this that needs no ornament. To give birth in that world was to be surrounded by women who took your weight upon themselves, who walked when you walked and pushed when you pushed, and did not let you fall. Whatever the dangers of the medieval childbed, and they were real, no woman went through it untouched and unheld. She was, from first pain to last, in the arms of her own community. Let us turn now to the special food baked for the occasion, the groaning cake. Among the customs of childbirth in many parts of England and beyond was the baking of a special cake and cheese for the birth, known by the plain. Affectionate names of the groaning cake and the groaning cheese, the groaning being that of the laboring mother. These were prepared as her time drew near, and shared among the women who gathered to attend her, and sometimes portions were kept and given out afterward to visitors, or to the poor, or pressed upon the newborn's future in one small ritual or another. The customs around these foods varied from region to region and grew tangled with all manner of local belief. In some places the father was to have the first cut, in others a piece was kept for the child, to pass through the hole in a cheese. In still others crumbs were shared out for luck. Beneath the variations lay a single warm idea, that a birth was an occasion, a thing to be marked and fed and celebrated among the women, and not merely endured. To bake a cake for a birth was to treat the hard event as a kind of feast, however solemn, and to fold it into the same round of shared food that marked every other great moment of village life. The groaning cake sat, in its homely way, alongside the wedding feast and the funeral meal. one more occasion on which the community gathered around food to see one of its own through a threshold, and it lent the whole anxious business a note of homely, hopeful cheer. Let us turn now to the rare authority the chamber gave to women. For the length of a birth, the chamber became something almost unique in the medieval world, a space entirely under the authority of women. Even in the greatest households, where a woman's life was otherwise hedged about by the rule of fathers and husbands, the birth room turned the ordinary order on its head. Men were shut out, and within those walls the midwife and the gathered women governed themselves, made their own decisions, kept their own counsel, and answered, for those hours, to no man at all. This inversion was so complete that it drew, at times, a certain unease from the men outside, who could not know what passed within, and were not permitted to ask. The sealed female chamber was a small sovereign territory in the very heart of a man's house, and the knowledge that governed it was one he did not share. Some of the wider suspicion that gathered around midwives and birth chamber customs surely drew on this simple fact that here, for once, the women were entirely in charge and the men entirely excluded. For the women themselves, it must have been a rare and not unwelcome thing. Whatever the pain and the danger of the hour, the birth chamber was theirs, run by their own rules and their own knowledge, a place where the oldest and wisest among them held unquestioned command. In a world that gave women little enough authority elsewhere, this one deep and ancient domain remained, from first to last, their own. Let us turn now to the long night itself and the vigil the women kept. Because a labor so often ran through the night, the women settled in for a vigil, prepared to stay for as long as it took. They took turns to rest, dozing in a corner while others watched, so that the laboring mother was never without company and the midwife was never without hands. Through the small hours they talked low, and prayed, and shared the caudle, and told the old stories and the old reassurances, keeping the fear at bay with the simple warmth of company. There was a rhythm to these long vigils, a slow patient passing of the hours that must have steadied many a frightened woman. The labor rose and ebbed, the candles burned down and were replaced, the fire was fed, the women murmured and rested and roused again, and through it all the mother was carried on a current of familiar voices and familiar hands. The night was long, but it was not lonely, and it was not silent. For those who have kept a long night's watch beside someone they love, there is something deeply recognizable in this. The hours stretch, the world outside falls away, and what remains is the small circle of the room, the low light, the quiet voices, the shared and patient waiting. The medieval birth chamber, for all its distance from us, held that same tender, wakeful intimacy, women watching together through the dark until the dawn or the child arrived. Let us turn now from the women and the room to the herbs they trusted, beginning with raspberry leaf. Of all the herbs associated with childbirth, none is more enduringly linked to it than the leaf of the raspberry, gathered from the hedgerow and the garden and dried for use through the year. A tea made from the dried leaves was drunk in the later weeks of pregnancy, and through the labor itself, held to strengthen the mother, to tone and ready her body, and to ease the pains and the work of the birth. It was among the gentlest of the birth herbs, mild enough to be taken freely, and it was trusted almost everywhere. The old herbals and the later receipt books alike recommend it, and the country memory of its use ran deep and long, surviving in cottage practice for centuries. A mother might begin sipping the tea as her time approached, and the midwife might have it warming on the hearth through the labor, offered in small cups between the pains, both for its supposed virtues and for the plain comfort of a warm, familiar drink in a hard hour. What is quietly remarkable about raspberry leaf is how far its reputation has traveled through time. It is among the very few birth chamber remedies of the medieval world that a person might still be handed today, dried and bagged, with much the same words attached to it. Whatever a modern chemist makes of it, the leaf has kept its place in the long story of childbirth for the better part of 1,000 years, passed down mother to daughter in an almost unbroken line. Let us turn now to mugwort, which the old herbalists called the mother of herbs. Mugwort grew wild and abundant along the waysides and hedgerows, a tall plant with silvery, backed leaves, and it held so central a place in the old healing that one ancient tradition named it the mother of herbs, first among them all. In the care of childbirth, it was reached for again and again. It was made into a warm bath or a fomentation, laid at the feet, or steeped into a drink, and it was held to bring on a slow labor, to ease the birth, and to help the body deliver the afterbirth once the child was safely come. Its uses reached beyond the practical into the protective. Sprigs of mugwort were hung about the chamber and the household as a guard against ill influence, and the plant carried, in folk memory across much of Europe, an air of quiet power, a herb of thresholds and of women's mysteries. That it should stand so close to the great threshold of birth seems only fitting, and midwives kept it dried and ready as one of the surest of their birth herbs. Like many of the strongest birth herbs, mugwort was a plant to be used with knowledge and care, in the right amount and at the right time, and this was exactly the sort of judgment that the long apprenticeship of a midwife existed to teach. In her experienced hands it was a valued help. It is one of many reminders that the herbs of the birth chamber were not gentle playthings, but real and potent medicines, respected accordingly by the women who wielded them. Let us turn now to birthwort, the plant that wore its purpose in its very name. Few herbs announced their use as plainly as birthwort, whose name in the old tongues was built from the very words for birth. It was one of the classic herbs of delivery in the medieval pharmacopoeia, reached for to help bring on and complete a labor, and above all, to expel the afterbirth when it was slow to come. The old herbals prescribed it confidently for exactly these purposes, and it appears again and again in the written records of birth, chamber medicine. Its reputation rested partly on the old doctrine of signatures, the belief that a plant's form revealed its purpose. Birthwort's curious curved flower was thought to echo the shape of the parts it was meant to aid, and to the medieval mind this resemblance was no coincidence but a sign, deliberately set into the plant, of the use for which it had been made. Whether or not the sign meant anything, the herb was trusted on the strength of it for a very long time. It must be said, quietly and as history, that birthwort is now known to be a plant of real potency and real hazard, and it is no longer used as it once was. In the medieval chamber, though, it was a respected and much relied upon remedy, handled by women who had learned its use across long years, and it stands as a good example of how much genuine, hard-won pharmacological knowledge and how much hopeful guesswork lay tangled together in the herb lore of the age. Let us turn now to motherwort, whose very name marked it as a woman's herb. Motherwort took its name directly from the use to which it was most often put, the care of mothers, and it was valued through the medieval and later herbal tradition as a herb for the womb and for the heart together. After a birth, it was given to help the body settle, to ease the cramping after, pains that followed delivery, and to calm a mother whose heart was troubled or whose spirits were low in the difficult days that came after. Its old Latin name even carried the idea of a lion-hearted strength, and it was reached for whenever a woman's heart, in either sense, needed steadying. The herbalists praised it warmly. One old writer declared that there was no better herb to drive melancholy from the heart and to strengthen it, and midwives folded that gentle, calming reputation into their care of the new mother, brewing it into a tea for the uneasy weeks of recovery. It was a herb of the aftermath as much as the birth itself, tending the woman once the great effort was over and the long, tender work of healing had begun. There is a fittingness in a plant named for mothers taking its place so quietly in their care. Motherwort asked little, grew readily, and gave back a steadying of body and spirit at exactly the hour a new mother most needed both. Of all the birth herbs, it is among the tenderest in its associations, a plant that seemed made, in the old understanding, to sit at a weary mother's side and help her heart grow quiet again. Let us turn now to pennyroyal, a small mint of considerable strength. Pennyroyal was a low, creeping member of the mint family, sharply aromatic when crushed. That grew in damp places and was cultivated in many a garden. It was among the more powerful of the herbs a midwife might use, reached for to bring on a labor that lagged, to help the body expel the afterbirth, and to set right, as the old phrasing had it, the courses that had been stopped. Its scent alone was strong and unmistakable, and it was widely known and widely grown across medieval Europe. Because it was potent, pennyroyal was a herb that demanded knowledge and restraint, given in careful measure and at the proper moment by a woman who understood it well. This was precisely the kind of judgment that separated the experienced midwife from the well, meaning helper, for the same herb that could aid in the right hands and the right amount could do harm in the wrong ones. The long apprenticeship existed, in large part, to teach exactly this, the safe handling of strong and useful plants. We tell of it here as history, with the same caution the old midwives brought to it. Pennyroyal held a real and respected place in the birth chamber medicine of the age, one of a family of strong herbs whose powers were understood through long experience rather than through any chemistry. In the hands of a knowing woman it was a valued tool, handled with the care that its strength demanded and set aside when gentler herbs would serve. Let us turn now to tansy, bitter and bright along the garden edge. Tansy grew tall and hardy. Its flat clusters of button, yellow flowers a common sight along paths and garden borders, and its leaves gave off a sharp, bitter scent when bruised. In the care of women, it was used to bring on delayed courses and to help cleanse the body after a birth, and it had a wider reputation besides, against worms in children and as a strewing herb whose strong smell was thought to drive away flies and fleas from a room. It was, in short, a plant of many hard, practical uses, valued for its very bitterness. That bitterness was part of how it worked in the old understanding, for strong and bitter herbs were often held to have strong and cleansing effects. Tansy was another of the potent birth herbs, respected and used with care, its dose measured by the same experienced judgment that governed pennyroyal and mugwort. A midwife kept it dried among her stores and reached for it when its particular strength was called for, knowing exactly how much and how little to give. Tansy also carried a place in the wider ritual life of the year. Folded into certain dishes at particular seasons and tangled about with old customs of spring cleansing of the blood after a long winter of salted food. In the birth chamber, though, it kept to its serious purposes one more of the bitter, cleansing herbs on which the old midwifery leaned, handled always with the quiet respect that its strength had earned across generations of use. Let us turn now to feverfew, gentle cleanser of the womb after birth. Feverfew, with its small daisy, like flowers, and its pale, faintly bitter leaves, was among the most frequently used of all the women's herbs, and it had a particular association with the days just after a birth. It was given warm to help the body expel the afterbirth and to cleanse the womb, and to ease the cramping pains that came as the womb drew itself slowly back to its ordinary size. Its old name spoke to its use against fevers, but its place in the birth chamber was at least as important, and it appears constantly in the records of women's medicine. The herbalists recommended it warmly and often, and midwives kept it always among their stores, for its uses ran right through the whole event of a birth and its aftermath. Given in the tender days of early recovery, it was one of the herbs a new mother might take repeatedly. Brewed into a warm and slightly bitter tea, and sipped through the quiet hours of her lying in. Like motherwort, it was a herb of the aftermath, tending the woman through the long settling that followed her delivery. Feverfew's bitterness, like that of so many of these herbs, was often softened for the taking, folded into honey or a warm sweetened posset rather than offered plain. These small kindnesses of preparation, learned through long practice, were part of the midwife's art, and they turned a harsh but useful medicine into something a weary mother could actually be persuaded to swallow again and again through the days of her recovery. Let us turn now to dittany, the storied birth herb of the old books. Dittany, and especially the dittany of Crete, was among the most celebrated of all the herbs of childbirth in the written tradition, its fame reaching back to the ancient world and carried forward into the medieval herbals with all its old prestige intact. The classical writers told that wild goats, wounded by hunters, sought it out to draw the arrows from their flesh, and from such tales the plant gathered a reputation for drawing out and expelling that made it, by natural extension, a prized herb for helping a birth and delivering the afterbirth. The difficulty in the north of Europe was that true dittany of Crete grew far away, in the warm lands of the Mediterranean, and had to be bought at cost from the spice merchants, if it could be had at all. So the northern herbals and the northern midwives often turned to a homelier substitute, the plant sometimes called dittany or false dittany, that grew nearer to hand, hoping it carried something of the same virtue. The famous herb was, for most village women, a name from the books rather than a thing they ever held. Dittany reminds us that the herb lore of the birth chamber had two layers, the written and the lived. In the manuscripts, exotic and storied plants held pride of place, carried down from the ancient authorities, with their legends attached. In the actual cottage and the actual chamber, the herbs used were mostly the humble ones that grew in the garden and the hedge close by. The village midwife knew both worlds and made do wisely with what was truly within her reach. Let us turn now to fenugreek and the warm oils of anointing. Alongside the herbs taken inwardly, the midwife made much use of things applied to the body, and chief among these were the softening seeds and the warm oils. Fenugreek and linseed, steeped in warm water, gave up a soft, slippery mucilage that was used in soothing fomentations, and warm oils, pressed from almonds or lilies, or simply rendered from clean animal fat, were warmed by the fire and used to anoint. These softenings and anointings were held to ease and open the body, to soothe the straining tissues, and to make the passage of the child gentler. The midwife would warm the oil, test its heat against her own skin, and anoint her hands and the laboring woman both, working with a slow, easing touch. This was among the most physical and intimate parts of her craft, a laying on of warmed and oiled hands that must have brought real comfort amid the strain, and that spoke, without words, of care and of competence. Fenugreek carried a further use besides, for it was long held to bring on a good flow of milk, and so it followed the mother from her labor into the nursing that came after. These preparations remind us that the birth chamber's medicine was as much about touch and warmth as about any herb swallowed. The warmed oil, the soft fomentation, the anointing hand, all worked upon the body directly and gently, and all belonged to a craft that understood deeply and without any theory to explain it. How much a frightened, straining body is eased by warmth and by a knowing, unhurried touch. Let us turn now to the birth stool, that curious and ancient seat. The birth stool was among the oldest and most characteristic tools of the midwife, a low seat, often shaped like a crescent or a horseshoe, open at the front, with sturdy arms and a back for the laboring woman to brace against. Upon it she sat, upright and supported, while the midwife knelt or sat before the open front, ready to receive the child. The design was ancient, described by physicians of the classical world and carried down, little changed, across more than 1,000 years. And a woodcut of just such a stool illustrates the early printed midwife books. Some midwives owned and carried their own stool. Others made do with what the household had, propping a woman on a low chair or across the lap of a strong helper. But the true birth stool, purpose-made, was a prized thing where it existed, sometimes kept by a village and lent from birth to birth. Its whole design served a single idea, that a woman was best delivered sitting upright and supported, with the child helped downward by the natural pull of the earth. There is a long, quiet continuity in the birth stool that is worth pausing on. The same essential seat that a Roman midwife would have known was still in use in medieval villages, and versions of it lingered for centuries more. It is one of those rare objects that changed almost not at all across the whole sweep of recorded history, because the body it served, and the task, did not change either. In its plain crescent shape is folded 1,000 years, and more of women helping women give birth. Let us turn now to the upright positions in which children were born. The great difference between a medieval birth and the picture most of us carry now lies in the position of the mother, for she did not, as a rule, give birth lying down. She was delivered upright, seated on the birth stool, or kneeling, or squatting, or supported on another woman's lap, held and braced from behind. The bed where there was one was for rest and for the lying in afterward, not for the birth itself. Through the labor she was kept moving and upright as long as she could bear it, and she bore the child in one of these upright postures. The reasoning was plain and, by the lights of the age, sound. An upright position let the pull of the earth aid the child's descent, opened the body more fully, and let the mother use the strength of her own effort to the best advantage. It was the position that generations of watching and experience had settled upon as the one that best helped a birth along, and it held its place in ordinary practice for as long as women themselves managed childbirth without interference from without. To picture a medieval birth rightly, then, we must set aside the reclining figure and imagine instead a woman upright and surrounded, seated or kneeling amid a press of supporting women, held on every side, working with her whole body and with the earth's own pull to help her. It was, in its way, a more active and a more communal event than the one that later replaced it. The mother a laborer in the truest sense, upright and striving, and never for a moment alone. Let us turn now to the receiving of the child and the old word for it. As the birth drew to its close, the midwife took up her central place, kneeling or seated before the birth stool, her warmed and oiled hands ready to receive the emerging child. This receiving gave us one of the oldest and most enduring words for what she did, for she was said to catch the baby, and a midwife in some regions was known simply as the catcher, the one whose hands were there to take the child safely as it came. It was the moment her whole long skill converged upon. She guided the head as it emerged, easing it forth slowly and steadily, then the shoulders, and gathered the whole slippery, new arrived child into her waiting hands and her clean cloth. This was work of the utmost delicacy, done by touch as much as by sight in the dim room, and it drew on every hour of her long experience, on hands that knew what to do almost of themselves. However many births she had attended, this instant of catching a new life was the one on which all the rest turned. There is a plain and lovely honesty in that old word, catch. It carries no grand theory, no learned pretension, only the simple physical truth of the act, a pair of ready hands and a new life passing into them. Across all the centuries and all the changes since, that essential thing has not altered at all. A child is born, and someone is there, hands ready, to catch it, and for the whole of the Middle Ages that someone was, almost always, the midwife. Let us turn now to the midwife's own hands, and the care she gave them. The oldest texts on the subject were careful to note that the midwife's own hands were her chief instrument, and that she must keep them fit for their delicate work. She was advised to keep her fingernails pared short and smooth, and her hands soft and clean, anointed with a little oil, so that nothing rough or sharp about them might harm the mother or the newly delivered child at the tenderest moment. A woman whose hands were her tools tended them as any careful craftsman tends the instruments of his trade. This small counsel, set down in the ancient authorities and carried forward into the later manuals, tells us how finely the good midwife understood the gentleness her work required. The mothers knew it too, and trusted the smooth, sure hands of an experienced woman above all else, hands kept soft and paired precisely so that they might do their careful work without hurt. It is a small detail, easily passed over, and yet it gathers the whole spirit of her craft into a single quiet image. A pair of clean, paired, gently oiled hands, made ready to receive a life. Let us turn now to the guarding of those final moments. The last passage of a birth was the most delicate of all, and here the midwife's practiced hands did their most careful work. As the child's head crowned and came forth, she eased it slowly, supporting and guarding the mother's body, checking the pace of the birth so that nothing tore or came too fast. She cleared the child's face as it emerged, easing the way for its first breath, and received the body gently into the cloth. Every motion was measured, learned across a lifetime, aimed at bringing both mother and child through this narrow moment whole. Much of this was done by feel, her hands reading what her eyes, in the dim room, could not fully see, adjusting pressure and pace by an instinct too deep and too quick for thought. She had done it so many times that the knowledge lived in her fingers. And in the crucial seconds she did not reason but simply acted, guarding here, easing there, guiding the new life out along the safest path her long experience knew. It was the quiet summit of her whole craft. We should not imagine this always went smoothly, for it did not, and the dangers of these final moments were real and sometimes grievous. But the good midwife's careful, guarding hands turned aside a great deal of harm that haste or ignorance would have caused, and the gentleness she had learned to bring to this one narrow passage was, though no one measured it, among the truest medicines of the age. She could not master every outcome, but she could and did ease the way. Let us turn now to the loosening of everything, a custom half practical and half of the old magic. As a labor advanced, and especially if it went hard, a curious and widespread custom took hold in the birth chamber, the loosening of all things. Every knot in the room and about the mother was untied, her hair unbraided and let down, her clothing unlaced, and in some houses the chests and cupboards were opened, the doors unbarred, and any lock in the place was turned. Behind this lay a simple, sympathetic idea, that as all things in the house came open and unbound, so too the mother's body would open and the child come freely forth. The practice sat somewhere between the practical and the magical, and perhaps drew a little strength from both. Loosening a laboring woman's clothing and hair was sensible enough, easing and comforting her, and if the opening of chests and doors did nothing to her body, it did something, perhaps, to the minds of the anxious women in the room, giving them a small action to take against their helplessness. To open every lock was to say, with the hands, "May everything now open, may this go freely." It is one of the gentler of the old birth customs, and one of the most human. Faced with the frightening mystery of a labor that would not progress, the women did what people have always done before a mystery. They made a symbol of their hope and enacted it, turning every key and loosing every knot in a wordless prayer for opening. Whatever we make of it now, the tenderness beneath it, the longing for the hard passage simply to open and ease, is one anyone can understand. Let us turn now to the birth girdle, the long inscribed roll wrapped about the mother. Among the most remarkable of all the aids a laboring woman might be given was the birth girdle, a long strip of parchment, sometimes several feet in length, inscribed with prayers, holy names, and protective charms, which was wrapped or laid about her belly during the labor. Several of these survive, and they are extraordinary objects, narrow rolls covered in devout writing and small holy images, some of them plainly much used, worn and stained from having been handled and worn by one laboring woman after another across the years. The girdle worked in the understanding of the age by bringing the protective power of its holy words into direct contact with the mother's body at her hour of danger. The prayers written upon it, the names of God and the saints, the measured length said to match the height of Christ or the wounds he bore, all were believed to gather about her a shield of sacred protection. She wore the words themselves against her skin, the parchment a kind of holy armor bound about the very place where the peril lay. That so many of these girdles show heavy signs of use tells us how deeply they were trusted and how often they were reached for. They were precious things, kept and lent and passed along, carried from house to house, wherever a birth was near. In the next part of our evening, we will follow these charms and girdles and prayers a little further, for they were among the most tender expressions of a very human wish to wrap the frightening hour of birth in every protection, holy or herbal, that the world could offer. Let us turn now to the holy girdles lent out from the monasteries. Beyond the inscribed parchment girdles that a household might own or borrow, there existed a far rarer and more precious kind, the relic girdle, kept in the treasuries of great monasteries and lent for a devout offering to women of standing at their hour of need. Certain abbeys were famed for possessing a girdle said to have belonged to the Virgin herself or to a saint, and these holy belts were carried out with great care to the birth chambers of noblewomen and queens, wrapped about them in the belief that the relic's power would see them safely delivered. The trade in this comfort was quiet but real. A monastery that held such a relic held a genuine treasure, sought after by the great families of the region, and the loan of it, hedged about with prayer and offering, was among the services a religious house could render to its powerful neighbors. Records survive of these girdles being sent for, borrowed, and returned, their journeys to and from the birth chambers of the mighty carefully noted in the account books of the houses that kept them. For the ordinary village woman, of course, such a relic was as far beyond her reach as a bishop's palace, and she made do with her humbler parchment roll or her borrowed charm. But the existence of these grand girdles tells us how universal the underlying wish was, from the cottage to the castle. Whether the belt was a strip of a poor clerk's writing or a fragment believed to have touched the Virgin, the longing it answered was exactly the same. A mother's hope to be wrapped in protection through the danger of her hour. Let us turn now to Saint Margaret, above all others the saint of the birth chamber. Of all the saints called upon in childbirth, none was invoked more often or more fervently than Saint Margaret of Antioch. Her legend told of a young woman swallowed whole by a dragon, who yet burst forth from its belly alive and unharmed. And in that image of a safe and miraculous deliverance, the medieval mind saw a perfect patroness for birth. Her name was spoken over laboring women across the whole of Christendom, and her life was among the texts most often read aloud in the chamber, or written upon the girdles laid across a mother's belly. The book of her life itself became a kind of holy object in the birth room. Where a woman could not read it, it might simply be laid upon her, its very presence thought to lend its protective virtue, so that the story of Margaret's own deliverance from the dragon's belly might, by a kind of holy sympathy, help along the deliverance now underway. Copies of her life were kept for exactly this purpose. Some worn soft from being carried from birth to birth about a parish. There is a tenderness in the choosing of her that is easy to feel. The women of the age looked for a protector who understood, in her own story, the terror of being trapped and the wonder of coming through it alive, and they found her in Margaret. To speak her name over a laboring woman was to place that woman inside the oldest and most hopeful of stories, the one in which the frightening dark is survived and the trapped soul comes forth again into the light. Let us turn now to the eagle stone, that strange and costly charm. Among the most curious of all the aids to birth was the eagle stone, a hollow nodule of iron, or that held loose within it a smaller stone that rattled when the whole was shaken. To the medieval eye, this was a stone pregnant with another stone, and by the logic of sympathy that governed so much of the old thinking, it was held to have power over pregnancy and birth. Bound to the mother, it would, it was believed, help her carry and then help her deliver, the little stone within drawing the child down as the great one was moved. The custom of its use was precise and revealing. Through the pregnancy and the labor, the eagle stone was bound high on the body, to the arm or above, to hold the child up and safe. But at the moment of birth it was moved down and bound to the thigh, to draw the child down and out, and then, crucially, it was removed at once, quickly, the instant the child was born, for it was feared that if it lingered it would draw the womb itself down after the child. It was a costly and much prized possession, lent among kinswomen and neighbors, and passed down as a treasure. The eagle stone shows, as well as any single object, can the whole cast of the medieval mind about birth, its close attention, its logic of likeness, its blend of the practical and the magical. There is even a poignancy to that careful removal at the last, the fear of the womb following the child. Whatever the stone could or could not do, the women who used it watched a birth with the closest and most anxious care, and shaped their every action around a deep and hopeful theory of how such things worked. Let us turn now to the written charms and holy words laid upon the mother. Beyond the girdle and the saint's life, the birth chamber made use of a whole small library of written charms, words set down on scraps of parchment or paper and laid upon the laboring woman, or bound to her, or set about the room. Some bore simple prayers, others carried holy names, the names of God, of the Virgin, of the three kings of the Nativity, or older word, squares whose letters could be read the same in several directions, and which had drifted down from antiquity, trailing a reputation for power. These were laid on the belly, or worn, or sometimes even, in extremity, written and then washed off into a drink. The exact words varied enormously, and their meaning was often only half understood, even by those who used them, copied and recopied across generations, until some had worn down into strings of holy, seeming letters whose sense was long lost. But the belief beneath them was steady, that the sacred word, brought near to the body in its hour of need, carried a real protecting force. In a world where the written word was itself rare and powerful, to lay writing upon a laboring woman was no small thing. These charms remind us how the whole event of birth was wrapped, layer upon layer, in every kind of help the age could imagine. The herb in the cup, the oil on the hands, the stone at the thigh, the girdle at the waist, the saint's book on the belly, the written word laid over all. Each was one more thread in a net of protection the women wove about the mother. None of it was thought to exclude the others. All of it together was simply how one saw a woman safely through. Let us turn now to the amulets of peony, coral, and amber. Certain natural things were worn as amulets in and around the birth chamber, prized for a protective virtue thought to dwell in the substance itself. Foremost among them was the root of the peony, carved into beads and hung about the neck, long held to guard against harm and, in particular, to protect children and to ease the troubles of women. Red coral was valued in much the same way, its bright color and its origin in the sea lending it, in the old belief, a special power to shield the vulnerable, and coral beads were placed on infants as readily as on mothers. Amber, warm and golden and strangely light, carried its own quiet reputation, worn against various ills and valued for the faint life that seemed to stir in it when it was rubbed and drew small things toward itself. These substances were not herbs to be swallowed, but virtues to be worn, kept close against the skin, so their protection might pass into the body of the one who wore them. A mother and her newborn might both be hung with such things, wrapped in a quiet armor of root and stone and resin. The faith in these amulets ran deep and long, outlasting much else besides, and coral in particular kept its place about the necks of infants for centuries. Beneath the specific beliefs lay the same universal impulse we have met again and again tonight, the wish to place between a beloved and vulnerable body and the dangers of the world some small, tangible token of protection, something to hold and to wear and to trust, at the hour when trust was most needed and hardest to come by. Let us turn now to the prayers spoken aloud over the laboring woman. Woven through the whole of the labor were the spoken prayers, murmured by the midwife and the gathered women over the one giving birth. Many called upon the saints of childbirth, Margaret above all, but also Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin, and so the patroness of mothers, and others besides, each named and asked to lend her aid. Others recalled the holy births of Scripture, the nativity of Christ, the births of the prophets, setting the present labor within that sacred company, and asking that it too be brought safely through. These prayers followed old and half-remembered forms, some passed down in the same worn phrases across generations, spoken in the rhythm of the pains. A low and steady undercurrent of sound beneath the physical work of the birth. They comforted the laboring woman, gave the attendants something to do with their fear, and gathered the whole event up into the larger faith that governed every part of medieval life. To pray over a birth was as natural as to warm the water, and as constant. We can hear, if we listen, how such prayer must have sounded, a soft and continuous murmur in the firelit room, rising a little with each pain and falling again in the rests between. The names of the saints repeated over and over like a slow tide. Whatever it did or did not accomplish, it filled the long hours with a steady, hopeful sound, and wrapped the laboring woman in voices, so that even in her hardest moments, she was never for an instant left in silence. Let us turn now to the candles, blessed at Candlemas. Among the holy things brought into the birth chamber, the blessed candle held a special place, and often it was one kept from the feast that fell at the very start of February, the Feast of the Purification, when candles were blessed in the churches and carried home. That feast itself commemorated a mother, the Virgin, being purified and presented at the temple after her own childbirth, and so its candles carried, from the first, a deep association with birth and with the safe passage of mother and child through its dangers. Such a candle, lit in the chamber during a labor, was more than a source of light. It was a sacramental thing, its blessed flame thought to lend protection and to keep ill influence at bay. A small burning point of holy fire kept alight through the long dark hours. A household might set aside its candlemas candle expressly for this use, keeping it through the year against the day a birth should come, and light it then with a sense of bringing the Church's own blessing directly into the room. There is a lovely circularity in this. The candles of the feast of one mother's purification, lit to guard another mother through her labor, the whole custom folding birth after birth into a single continuing story, reaching back to the nativity itself. The small flame in the birth chamber was, in this way, joined to the great flame of the feast, and the woman laboring in the firelight was joined, through it, to every mother the faith remembered, all the way back to the first. Let us turn now to the fine and shifting line between the oath and the charm. We come here to a quiet tension that ran through the whole of the midwife's world. She swore, in her oath, to use no charms or sorcery contrary to the Church, and yet the birth chamber was full of the girdles, the saints' books. The written words, the blessed candles, the whispered prayers we have just described. The apparent contradiction dissolves once we see where the age drew its line. What the Church supplied and blessed was holy help, permitted and encouraged. What a woman worked on her own account, outside the Church's sanction, was charm and suspect. The very same act might be either, depending on whose power stood behind it. So a girdle inscribed with the Church's prayers was a comfort, but a charm of a wise woman's own devising was a danger. A candle blessed at the altar was holy, but a stone bound to the thigh sat closer to the edge. The midwife lived along this shifting boundary, using the tender and hopeful comforts her mother had used, most of which wore a Christian face and passed without trouble, while the wider anxiety of the age watched, now and then, for the ones that did not. For the most part the line was navigated quietly and without incident, the small blessings and comforts of the chamber accepted as the ordinary furniture of a birth. It is worth holding both truths together as we leave this part of our evening. The charms and girdles and prayers were among the gentlest and most human of all the midwife's tools, born of pure care for a frightened woman, and they lived, all the same, on the uneasy border of what the age was fully willing to permit. Let us turn now, gently, to the harder hours, and first to the great virtue of patience. For all the herbs and charms and skilled hands, the truth at the center of the midwife's craft was that most births needed, above all, to be let alone to take their course. Her chief art, in the ordinary case, was not to do but to wait, to watch the slow progress of the labor, to encourage and comfort and steady, and to keep her hands still until they were truly needed. A birth was, in the great majority of cases, something a woman's own body accomplished, and the wise midwife's restraint, her refusal to meddle where meddling would only harm, was among the deepest parts of her skill. This patience was harder than it sounds, and it too had to be learned. To sit through the long hours with a frightened, laboring woman and to do, deliberately, very little, trusting the process to unfold, took a confidence born only of long experience. A less skilled attendant, unnerved by the waiting, might be tempted to intervene, to hurry, to try this or that, and so do damage that patients would have avoided. The best midwives knew that their stillness was often their greatest gift. There is real wisdom in this, that the age arrived at through nothing but watching, over countless births, what helped and what harmed. Left mostly alone, supported and warmed and encouraged, most laboring women delivered safely, and the midwife's genius lay in knowing this, in trusting it, and in reserving her active skill for the rarer hours when it was genuinely required. Her calm, watchful patience was, in the end, the safest medicine she had, and she practiced it night after night with the discipline of a lifetime. Let us turn now to the rarer and harder skill of turning a child. Now and then a child lay wrongly in the womb, set to come feet first, or crosswise, or in some other difficult presentation, and here the midwife's patience gave way to her most demanding skill. By careful touch she read how the child was lying, and in some cases she could, with a slow and knowing hand, turn the child within, bringing it round to a better position for its birth, or bringing down a foot to deliver it that way. This turning was an ancient art, described in the old physicians' texts, that had come down from the classical world and carried, at its best, across the generations of skilled women. It was work that demanded the surest judgment and the gentlest, strongest hands, and it was not lightly undertaken, for it carried real danger to both mother and child. Not every midwife could do it, and the ones who could were valued accordingly, sent for across some distance when a hard case was known to be coming. In her hands lay, quite literally, the turning of a birth from one that might end in grief to one that might yet come safely through. We tell this calmly, as the sober history it is. These were the hours that tested a midwife to her limit, when everything she knew was brought to bear in the dark, by feel alone, on a task that could save 2 lives or lose them. That some women mastered such a skill at all, without training beyond the watching of their elders and their own long practice, is a quiet testament to how much genuine art lay hidden within the old midwifery, unwritten and unsung. Let us turn now to the sneezing powders, a curious help in a hard hour. Among the tools a midwife might reach for when a birth needed urging on, or when the afterbirth was slow to come, was the sneezing powder, a pinch of some sharp substance, ground pepper or a little of a stronger herb, blown or given to make the woman sneeze hard. The violent, involuntary effort of a great sneeze was thought to help bear down the child, or to loosen and expel the afterbirth, harnessing the body's own sudden convulsion to the work at hand. It was an old and widespread trick, set down in the herbals and carried in the midwives' practice. There was a rough logic to it that experience seemed to bear out. A hard sneeze is a powerful, whole-body effort, and to provoke one at the right moment was to add that sudden force to the mother's own labor, at a point where a little more effort might make the difference. It was the kind of practical, bodily wisdom the midwifery was full of, arrived at not through any theory, but through long observation of what, in the event, seemed to help. Like so much of her craft, it was a matter of timing and judgment, used at the right moment and not the wrong one, by a woman who knew from experience when such a help was called for. It sits among the many small, ingenious practicalities of the old birth chamber, the accumulated tricks of generations, each one a little piece of hard-won knowledge about how to coax a difficult body through a difficult passage, kept alive in memory and passed from hand to hand. Let us turn now to the warm baths and fomentations of the long labor. Through a long and wearing labor, the midwife leaned heavily on warmth to ease and to help. She might have the woman sit over a vessel of warm water steeped with softening herbs, so that the gentle steam and heat could soothe and open the straining body, or she would press warm herb-soaked cloths against her back and her belly between the panes. The whole apparatus of warm water and warm cloth, kept ready by the never-failing fire, was brought to bear again and again across the hours, easing where it could and comforting always. Alongside the warmth went the steady work of keeping the mother's strength up, for a long labor was exhausting, and a spent woman labored poorly. Small sips of the cordial, of warm broth, of strengthening drinks were pressed on her through the hours, and she was encouraged, walked, rubbed and spoken to, kept from sinking into the despair that the sheer length of some labors could bring. The midwife's task in these hours was as much to sustain the woman's spirit and strength as to tend her body. This patient, warming, sustaining care, hour upon hour, was the true texture of most hard births, less a matter of dramatic intervention than of steady, unwearying attendance. The midwife and the gathered women simply kept on, warming the cloths, refilling the cup, murmuring encouragement, feeding the fire, holding the long line against exhaustion and fear until the labor, at last, moved on. It was undramatic, and it was often exactly what carried a woman through. Let us turn now softly to the hours when even all of this was not enough. We would tell an untrue and a kinder story than the truth if we did not acknowledge, gently, that there were births the midwife could not save. For all her patience, her herbs, her skilled and turning hands, some labors ran into troubles that the medicine of the age simply could not master, and both the very old sources and the sober judgment of history agree that childbirth was in those centuries a real and present danger to a woman's life. The midwife met these hardest hours with the only things she had left: her endurance, her honesty, and her prayer. She did not, in such a case, abandon the woman to it. She stayed, she did what could be done, she eased what pain she could, and she surrounded the laboring woman with the same warmth and the same held hands that had carried lighter births through. When her skill met its limit, she gave what remained to give, which was her presence and her care, and she did not pretend to a power she did not have. There is a hard dignity in that honesty, in a healer who knew exactly where her art ended and did not lie about it. We hold these hours calmly, as the women themselves learned to hold them, without flinching and without despair. They are part of the true picture, and to leave them out would be to make the midwife's world into a fairy tale. But they also throw into relief the quiet courage of the whole enterprise, of women who walked, again and again, knowingly, into a room where the outcome could not be promised, and gave their steady hands and their long knowledge to the frightening, hopeful, necessary work all the same. Let us turn now to the gravest of all the extremities, and we will pass through it softly. There was, in the medieval world, a surgical extreme so grave that it was never, in that age, performed upon a living woman. When a mother died in the course of a labor with the child still within her, it was sometimes attempted to open the body and take the child in the hope that it might yet be saved, or more often and more certainly, so that it might at least be baptized before it too was lost. In some places the church required this, holding that a dying or newly dead mother must be opened so that the child's soul might not be lost unchristened. This was work done in grief, at the very end of hope, and it belonged more to the priest's care for a soul than to the midwife's care for a body. It was never a means of delivery for the living, for the medicine of the age had no way to bring a woman through such an opening alive, and so it was reserved entirely for the saddest of all the birth chamber's hours. We name it here only for completeness, and gently as the sober record it is. We will not linger on it, for it belongs to the rarest and darkest edge of the whole story, and our evening is not made for dwelling in such places. It is enough to know that even here, at the utmost limit, the impulse that governed everything was the same, to save what could be saved, and failing that, to see even the smallest soul safely into the arms of the faith. Then we may turn our thoughts, with relief, back toward the warmth and the ordinary safe births that were, thankfully, the great majority. Let us turn now to the wisdom of knowing her own limits. Among the truest marks of a good midwife was that she knew the boundaries of her own skill and did not press beyond them out of pride. When a case ran harder than her experience could master, she sent for help, for another midwife more skilled in difficult births, or in the gravest extremity for a barber, surgeon whose harder trade might do what hers could not. To call for aid was no failure. It was, rather, the mark of the wisest sort of healer, the one who valued the mother's life above her own standing. This humility was itself a hard, one part of her craft, and not every attendant possessed it. It is easy to imagine how a lesser woman, unwilling to admit the limits of her knowledge, might have pressed on alone where sending for help would have served the mother better. The good midwife had learned, often through hard experience, exactly where her own art ended, and she was not too proud to say so and to summon what further help there was. There is a quiet greatness in that kind of self-knowledge, in a healer secure enough in her own long skill that she felt no need to pretend to more than she had. She had spent a lifetime learning what she could do, and, just as importantly, what she could not, and she governed her practice by both. The mother in her hands was safer for it, tended by a woman who knew the exact shape of her own knowledge and worked always, honestly, within it. Let us turn now, with the child safely born, to the first of the newborn's cares, the tying of the cord. Once the child was delivered and had drawn its first breath, the midwife's attention turned to the cord that still joined it to its mother, the navel string, as the old accounts called it. This she tied off carefully with a length of thread, and then cut, separating the child at last into a life of its own. The tying and the cutting were done with practiced care, at the proper distance, for a poorly managed cord could bring harm, and the small bound stump was then dressed, and the child's belly gently bound with a soft band while it healed. Custom gathered thickly about even this simple act. In some regions the length at which the cord was tied was believed to foretell or affect the child's later life, and old sayings attached themselves to how it was done, so that the midwife's small, practical decision carried, in the folk mind, a weight of meaning beyond the merely physical. She followed the customs of her region as she followed the practical necessities. The two braided together in her hands, as in everything else she did. It is a small and homely act to dwell on, this tying and cutting of a cord, and yet it is the very hinge of a life, the moment a child passes from being carried within another to being, for the first time, a separate creature in the world. The midwife's hands performed it thousands of times across her working life, quietly, competently, each time severing one life gently into two, and dressing the small wound of that separation with the same care she gave to everything else. Let us turn now to the rubbing of the newborn with salt. Among the first things done to a newborn child, in a custom of great antiquity, was to rub its skin with salt. The practice was ancient enough to be mentioned in the oldest scriptures, and it persisted through the medieval centuries and beyond. The salt was believed to cleanse the child's skin, to firm and toughen it, and to cleanse away the matter of birth, and the small body was gently rubbed over with it, sometimes mixed with other things, before or alongside its first washing. To modern ears the practice sounds harsh, but it was done gently and in a spirit of care, understood as a strengthening and a cleansing of the tender new skin against the hard world it had just entered. It sat among a whole set of first attentions, meant to ready the child for life outside the womb, to clean it, to firm it, to help it thrive, all performed by the same knowing hands that had just caught it. The salt was part of welcoming the child into the world of the living and the ordinary. That so old a custom, endured so long, tells us how deeply these first rituals of care were rooted, carried down from the ancient world into the medieval cottage almost unchanged. The midwife who salted a newborn was repeating a gesture older than the faith she prayed in, one of the oldest continuous acts of human care we can trace, the tending of a brand new body by experienced older hands, exactly as it had been done for uncounted generations before her. Let us turn now to the first bath. Soon after birth the child was given its first bath, in water warmed carefully by the ever-burning fire, and this too was surrounded with attentive care. The water was made comfortably warm, its heat tested against the tender skin of the wrist or the elbow, and to it might be added a little wine, or milk, or a soft herb or two, according to the custom of the place and the means of the house. In this the midwife washed the newborn gently clean of the matter of its birth, handling the slippery little body with the sure, careful touch that only long practice gives. The first bath was more than a cleaning. It was a small ceremony of welcome, a settling of the child into the ordinary comforts of warmth and water and gentle handling, and it was watched with tenderness by the gathered women. The midwife's competence here, her easy sureness with the fragile new body, was itself a reassurance to the mother, a sign that her child had passed into hands that knew exactly what to do with it. There is a warmth in the image that needs no adornment, the newborn lowered into the gently warmed water in the firelit room, washed by old and careful hands while the women look on, the whole hard night of labor resolving at last into this small, tender act of care. Whatever the dangers that had gone before, this was its gentle aftermath, the first of countless washings and tendings that would carry the child forward into its life, begun here, in warm water, by the light of the fire. Let us turn now to the touch of honey on the newborn's mouth. Before a child took its first milk, the midwife often attended to its mouth, rubbing the gums and the palate gently with a little honey, or sometimes butter, both to cleanse the mouth and, it was thought, to stir the child's appetite and ready it to suckle. A small taste of honey or of a little wine was sometimes given as a kind of first nourishment, a welcome and a strengthening offered in the hours before the mother's milk had properly come in. This gentle attention to the mouth belonged to the same set of careful first offices as the salting and the bathing, each a small, practiced act aimed at easing the child into life and into feeding. Honey was valued across the whole of the old medicine for its cleansing and healing virtues, and its use here, on the mouth of a newborn, folded that trust into the very first hour of a child's existence. The midwife's honeyed fingertip was, in its way, among the first kindnesses the world offered the new arrival. We might notice, across all these first cares, how much of the midwife's craft was tenderness made practical. The salting, the bathing, the honey on the gums, the binding of the cord, none was elaborate, and all were done with a sure and gentle competence born of long repetition. Together they made up the whole warm ceremony of receiving a child, a set of small, wise attentions handed down through generations, by which each new life was cleaned and eased and welcomed into the company of the living. Let us turn now to the swaddling of the child. Once cleaned and tended, the newborn was swaddled, wound firmly but gently in long bands of soft linen that bound its arms to its sides and its legs together, wrapping it into a snug, warm bundle. This was done to keep the child warm, to make it feel secure, and, in the belief of the age, to help its soft limbs grow straight and true, the firm binding thought to guide the tender bones and prevent them growing crooked. The swaddling bands, prepared beforehand among the child-bid linen, were among the first possessions of every medieval child. The wrapped child was easy to hold and to carry, kept warm and contained, and the practice was near universal across medieval Europe, its logic accepted without question. A well-swaddled infant was a properly tended one, and the skill of winding the bands neatly and snugly, firm enough to support, but never so tight as to harm, was part of the practical knowledge the midwife brought and the mother learned. The image of the swaddled child, wound tight in its linen bands, became one of the most familiar of the whole age, painted again and again in the very scenes of the Nativity. There is a deep and simple comfort in swaddling that the age understood well, the wrapping of a new and startled creature into a snug, warm hold not unlike the one it had just left. Whatever we make now of binding the limbs, the impulse beneath it, to make the newborn feel held and secure and warm against the sudden vastness of the world, is a tender one, and the sight of a peaceful swaddled infant, quiet in its wrappings, was as reassuring to the medieval eye as it remains to ours. Let us turn now to the gentle shaping of the newborn's body. Part of the midwife's first care of a child was a gentle examining and shaping of its small body, running her knowing hands over its head and limbs, easing and smoothing where she felt the need. The soft head of a newborn, a little molded by its birth, she would gently shape and settle, and she checked the limbs and the small frame for wholeness and health, all with a light and practiced touch. This was done partly to help the child settle into its proper form, and partly to reassure the mother that all was as it should be. The care taken here reflected a deep tenderness toward the fragility of the new body, and a belief that its final shaping was not yet quite finished, that a knowing hand might help it settle right. Whatever the physical effect, the midwife's gentle inspection served also to reassure, her calm handling of the child and quiet word that all was well among the first comforts a new mother received. To watch experienced hands move over her child and hear that all was sound was, after the fear of the labor, a profound relief. It is worth pausing on how much of a newborn's first hour was spent being handled with such attentive gentleness by hands that had performed these same offices countless times before. The child came into a world of warmth and careful touch, salted, bathed, honeyed, shaped and swaddled, each attention a small act of welcome. Whatever hardships lay ahead in a medieval life, its very first hour was, so often, one of the most tender it would ever know. Let us turn now to the call, and the good fortune it was thought to bring. Now and then a child was born with a portion of the birth membrane still clinging over its head or face, and such a child was said to be born in the call, and it was reckoned a sign of great good fortune. The call itself was regarded as a powerful and lucky thing, and the midwife would carefully lift it from the child, dry it, and preserve it, for it was believed to protect its owner from harm, and above all from drowning. So strong was this belief that dried calls were sought after and even bought, particularly by sailors and others who went upon the water, as a charm against the sea. The child born in the call was thought to be marked out for luck, and sometimes for special gifts besides, and the preserved membrane, carefully kept, might follow that person through life, or be passed to another for its protecting power. It is one of the many beliefs that gathered about the mystery of birth, finding meaning and omen in its small variations, and reading fortune in the manner of a child's arrival into the world. The call is a gentle superstition to rest on, harmless and even lovely. That a child arriving still half, wrapped in the veil of its birth, should be thought blessed, and its small dried keepsake carried as a guard against the deep. The midwife, who alone would notice and preserve it, was the keeper of this luck as of so much else, lifting the call with care and drying it for the fortunate child. One more of the small graces she gathered and kept from the great event she oversaw. Let us turn now to the first quiet hours, once all was done. When the child was caught and cleaned, salted and bathed, honeyed and shaped and swaddled, and the mother eased and settled, there came at last a quieting of the whole long labor of the night. The swaddled child was laid warm beside its mother, or held near the fire, and the chamber, which had been so full of effort and anxiety, softened into a gentler watchfulness. The midwife did not simply leave. She stayed, keeping her eye on both mother and child through the first fragile hours, when the danger was not yet wholly past. These first hours held their own quiet care. The mother was tended and warmed and given her restoring drinks. The child watched over as it slept its first sleep, and the women, weary now, settled into a softer version of their long vigil, their voices low, the worst of the fear behind them. The room that had rung with the work of birth grew still and warm and hushed, holding the new mother and the new child together in its firelit safety. There is a deep peace in that image of the aftermath, the labor done, the child come, the room quiet at last, the fire, burning low, the exhausted mother resting with her swaddled infant near, and the old midwife keeping a patient watch over them both. It is the picture the whole long night had been working toward, and it is a good and gentle one to hold, a small warm room in the dark, and within it, safe for now, a mother and her newborn, and the wise woman who had brought them through. Let us turn now to the long rest that followed, the lying in. A birth did not end the midwife's care, nor the mother's need of rest. For after the child was safely come there, began the lying in, a period of days and often weeks in which the new mother kept to her bed and her chamber, recovering her strength. This was understood as a necessary and important time, not a luxury, a span of protected rest during which the mother did no work and was tended and served by others, allowed to heal from the great effort and the real dangers of her delivery. The length of it varied with custom and with means, but the principle was widely held that a delivered woman must be given time. The lying in was reckoned, in many places, to run until the churching some weeks later, often around a month or 40 days after the birth, marking the whole span as a single sheltered season set apart from ordinary life. Through it the mother remained largely within her chamber, tended by the women about her, her only tasks to rest, to recover, and to begin the care of her child. The world was kept at a little distance, and the household ran, for a while, without her. There is real wisdom and real kindness in this custom of protected rest. The age, for all its hardships, understood that a woman who had just given birth needed time to heal, and it built that understanding into a recognized, respected season of the household's life. Whatever else was hard in a medieval woman's lot, at this one point her body's need was, at least in principle, honored, and she was given leave simply to lie still and mend, tended by the women who had seen her through. Let us turn now to the phrase for it, being in the straw, the state of the lying, in went by many homely names, and among the most enduring was the saying that a woman was in the straw. A plain phrase, drawn from the humble bedding of childbed and carried into common speech for the whole condition of the recovering mother. To be in the straw was to be newly delivered and keeping to one's chamber, set apart in the warm, dim room, much as it had been kept during the birth itself, the shutters still drawn, the fire still tended, the world still held gently at bay. The chamber during the lying in remained a soft, enclosed, and largely female world, its warmth and quiet maintained for the mother's healing. She kept to her bed, or near it, and the same instinct that had sealed the room for the birth kept it sheltered now, warm and shaded and calm, a place of recovery insulated from the draughts and demands of the ordinary house. The gossips and kinswomen who had attended the birth came and went, and the room stayed, for these weeks, the still center of the household. The phrase in the straw has a rough tenderness to it that suits the whole custom, homely and unpretentious, rooted in the plain materials of a country childbed. It reminds us that for most women, this sheltered season unfolded not in any grand chamber, but in an ordinary house made as warm and soft as it could be managed, the straw of the bedding standing, in the end, for the whole gentle idea of it, that a delivered woman should be allowed to lie warm and still and mend. Let us turn now to the restoring foods of the childbed. Through the lying in, the new mother was nourished with special care, given warming and strengthening foods, and drinks meant to rebuild the strength her labor had spent. Chief among these were the caudles and possets that had sustained her through the birth itself, now offered again to restore her, the caudle of warm spiced ale, or wine thickened with egg, and the posset, a comforting drink of hot milk curdled with ale or wine, and sweetened and spiced. These were warming, nourishing, and easy to take, and they were pressed upon the recovering mother throughout her rest. Alongside them came broths and other gentle, strengthening dishes, the best the household could manage, for feeding up a new mother was understood as an important part of her recovery. The women who tended her saw to it that she was well and warmly fed. The whole apparatus of caudle and posset and broth kept going for her sake as it had been for the birth. Good food, warm and frequent, was among the plainest and most trusted of all the medicines of the lying in. These warm, spiced, comforting drinks became so bound up with childbed and recovery that they carried in the common mind a lasting association with care and convalescence of every kind. To make someone a posset was to tend them, to wish them well and mend them with warmth from within. In the birth chamber and the lying-in room, that association was at its truest and most tender, the recovering mother wrapped in warmth without and warmed within by the steady, nourishing kindness of those who tended her. Let us turn now to the mother's rest from all labor of the house. Through the whole of her lying in, the new mother was released from the work of the household, and this was among the most genuine gifts the custom gave her. The endless round of tasks that filled an ordinary woman's day, the cooking and cleaning and fetching, the tending of beasts and children, the spinning that never ended, all of it was taken up by others while she lay recovering. Her kinswomen, her neighbors, an older daughter, a hired help among those who could afford one, kept the house running so that she might do nothing but heal and tend her newborn. For a woman whose days were otherwise an unbroken chain of labor, this respite must have been extraordinary, perhaps the only sustained rest of her adult life. To lie warm and tended, freed of every duty but the care of her child, while the work of the house went on in other hands, was a thing that happened only here, in the sheltered weeks of childbed. Whatever the pain and danger of the birth that had bought it, the rest that followed was a real and recognized release. This too rested on the web of reciprocity that bound the women of a village together. For those who took up her tasks now would themselves be tended in their turn. The household did not simply manage without her by accident. It managed because others stepped deliberately into her place, giving their labor to buy her rest, in the sure knowledge that the same would be given back to them when their own hour came. Her stillness was made possible by their work, freely lent and surely repaid. Let us turn now to the visitors who came to her chamber. The lying-in was not a lonely time, for the new mother received a steady stream of visitors through her weeks of rest, all of them women. Her gossips returned, and her kinswomen, and the neighbors, coming to see her and the child, to sit and talk, and to bring gifts. These gifts might be food to strengthen her, delicacies a household could spare, small things for the baby, or simply the offering of company, and the visits gave the sheltered weeks a warm and sociable rhythm, a slow procession of familiar faces through the quiet room. The custom kept its firmly female character to the end. It was women who visited, women who sat with the mother and admired the child and shared the caudle that was offered round. the whole social world of the childbed remaining, as the birth itself had been, a gathering of women. The father and the men of the household stood at its edge, welcoming the news and the well-wishers, but the chamber and its slow, warm sociability belonged to the women who filled it. There is a gentle pleasure in imagining these visits. The new mother propped in her bed in the warm, dim room, her swaddled child beside her, a friend or two settled near, with their own work in their hands, the talk low and easy, a cup of something warm passing between them. After the fear and effort of the birth, these were kindly weeks, sociable and slow, and they wrapped the recovering mother in exactly the sort of unhurried female company that the whole custom of childbed was built to provide. Let us turn now to the great gulf between the rich woman's lying in and the poor woman's. For all that the custom of the lying in was shared across the whole of society, its practice differed enormously between the great and the humble, and here the hard divisions of the age showed themselves plainly. A lady of rank might keep to her richly hung chamber for a month or more, attended by many women, her lying in an elaborate and costly ceremony with its own strict stages, the room dressed in the finest textiles, the visits formal and numerous. Her recovery was a grand and leisurely affair, cushioned by every comfort wealth could buy. The poor cottager's wife had no such luxury of time, though the ideal of rest applied to her too. The plain necessities of a hard life often cut it short, and a woman with no one to spare for her work, and no store of food to sustain an idle month, might be back at her tasks within days of her delivery, her lying in measured in a handful of days rather than weeks. The custom bent, as all customs did, before the hard facts of poverty, and the rest a poor woman got was often far less than the one her body needed. Yet even here the ideal held some force, and the neighbors turning out to help meant that even a poor woman was rarely left entirely without support in her first days. The gulf between manor and cottage was real and wide, but the underlying belief that a delivered woman ought to be given rest and care reached in some measure into even the humblest house. That it could not always be honored there does not lessen the fact that it was everywhere understood to be owed. Let us turn now to the slow return of the light. As the mother's strength returned across the weeks of her lying in, the sealed dimness of the chamber was gradually eased. The shutters opened a little at a time, the hung cloths drawn back, the daylight readmitted by degrees. This slow return of the light matched the slow return of the mother to the ordinary world. A gentle reawakening from the sheltered dark of the childbed toward the full day of common life. It was not done all at once, but eased in stages, as her body and her strength were ready for it. This gradual reopening had both a practical and a symbolic sense. A body long kept in warmth and dimness was eased gently back toward light and air, not thrust into them. And the measured stages of it marked the mother's recovery like the slow lightening of a dawn. Each degree of readmitted daylight was a small sign of progress, a step back toward the threshold she would finally cross at her churching, when she would leave the chamber altogether and return to the world and the church beyond. There is something quietly beautiful in this managed return of the light, the darkened room of birth and recovery slowly brightening as the mother mended, until at last it was an ordinary lit chamber again, and she was ready to leave it. The whole season of childbed had its own arc of light, from the sealed golden dimness of the birth, through the sheltered shade of the lying, into this slow reopening toward day. The physical light of the room rising in step with the mother's own return to strength and to the wider life she had left to bear her child. Let us turn now to the churching, the ceremony that closed the whole season. The season of childbed came to its formal end with the churching, the ceremony in which the mother returned to the church some weeks after her delivery, most often around 40 days after, to give thanks for her safe passage through birth and to be received again into the full life of the congregation. It echoed, deliberately, the older story of the Virgin's own purification and presentation at the temple after the birth of Christ, and it marked, with the Church's blessing, the mother's return from the set, apart world of childbed to the ordinary world of the parish. The churching was a thanksgiving above all, a formal, blessed marking of the plain and enormous fact that the mother had come safely through, that she and her child were alive, and that she might now take up her place among her neighbors again. In an age when a safe delivery could never be taken for granted, this giving of thanks was heartfelt, a real and grateful acknowledgement of a danger survived, offered before God in the presence of the community. It closed the arc that the birth had opened, drawing the whole season of chamber and lying into a clear and hopeful end. Until she was churched, the mother remained, in a sense, still within the special world of childbed. After it, she was fully returned, restored to her work, her worship, and her ordinary life among the living. The ceremony was the door between the two, and passing through it, the mother left the long sheltered season behind and stepped back into the common daylight of the parish. Let us turn now to the veil and the candle she carried to the church door. The churched mother came to her ceremony in a manner marked out by custom, veiled, and often carrying a lighted candle, and she was met at the door of the church by the priest. For in many places she did not simply walk in, but was received and led in, the threshold itself part of the rite. The veil and the candle set her apart on this her special day, the one on which the whole community's attention turned for a gentle moment to her survival and her return. The lighted candle she bore recalled again the feast of the purification with its blessed candles, binding her churching to that older commemoration of a mother's return, and lending her small procession a note of quiet solemnity. Veiled and candle-bearing, met and led by the priest, she made of her return a marked and dignified occasion, no mere slipping back into the pews, but a formal readmission, witnessed and blessed. There is a real tenderness in the ceremony's care to mark her out, to make of her return something seen and honored, rather than unremarked. She had gone alone into the danger of birth, and come through it, and the churching gathered the whole parish to witness her safe emergence, veiled and bearing her light, at the very door of the church. It gave to a private ordeal a public and a grateful acknowledgement, and set the seal of the whole community's relief upon her survival. Let us turn now to the psalms and the offering within the church. Once received at the door, the mother was led into the church, and there the priest recited over her the appointed psalms of thanksgiving and protection, words of gratitude for deliverance and of trust in God's keeping. She would make an offering according to her means and receive the priest's blessing, and so be formally restored to the full communion of the parish free once more to take her ordinary place among the worshippers. The whole rite was brief, but its meaning was large. The closing of her season of danger and separation. The psalms chosen spoke of help and of safekeeping, of the soul brought through peril, and they set her particular survival within the great and comforting frame of the faith, one more soul kept and delivered by a watchful providence. To hear them spoken over her in the familiar church, among her neighbors, was to be gathered back into the ordinary religious life of the community from which childbed had briefly set her apart. With the blessing given and the offering made, the thing was done. The mother rose from her churching restored, her season of childbed formally ended, her thanks formally offered, her place among the living and the worshipping fully hers again. She had entered the church a woman still marked by the special state of the newly delivered, and she left it simply a mother among mothers, returned and free and blessed. Let us turn now to the inn between weeks before that return. We should pause on the strange, set apart quality of the weeks between a birth and a churching, for the new mother in that span occupied a kind of threshold state, neither fully within the ordinary world nor wholly outside it. Custom and folk belief held her, in these weeks, to be in a special and somewhat delicate condition, and in some places she was thought best kept from certain ordinary activities, or even from entering the church itself, until her churching had restored her. She was, until then, in a gentle sort of suspension. This between state was not, at heart, a matter of shame or of taint, whatever harsher later readings sometimes made of it, but rather of a recognized, protected, transitional condition, a woman who had passed through the great mystery of birth and was making her slow way back to ordinary life. The customs that hedged her about in these weeks were of a piece with the sheltering of the whole childbed, keeping her within a special, careful state until she was ready, body and soul, to step back out of it. There is a logic to this that the modern mind can recognize once the harsher interpretations are set aside. A great passage had been undergone, and a period of transition, marked and protected, eased the return from it. The churching stood at the end of that transition as its clear and hopeful conclusion. The moment the threshold was finally crossed, and the mother came back, fully and formally, into the daylight world she had left to do the oldest and most dangerous work there is. Let us turn now to the midwife's place at the churching and the feast that followed. The midwife's role often did not end until this final ceremony, for she frequently accompanied the mother to her churching, present at the close of the season as she had been at its opening, the same trusted woman seeing the whole arc through from first pain to final thanksgiving. And after the churching, in many places, there followed a gathering, a churching feast among the women, the gossips and kinswomen who had attended the birth coming together once more, now in celebration rather than in labor. This feast was a happy and a female occasion, a marking of the safe conclusion of the whole event, the mother restored, the child thriving, the danger past. The women who had watched together through the anxious night, now gathered to eat and drink and rejoice together in the good outcome. And the midwife, honored guest and author of so much of it, was often at the center of the gathering. It was the glad counterpart to the solemn vigil, the same circle of women reconvened in relief and gladness. There is a fine completeness in this. the same women who had held the mother through her darkest hours, returning to celebrate her safe emergence, the whole social world of the childbed rounding off with a shared feast. It bound the beginning and the end together, the fear and the relief, into a single remembered event, and it sent the midwife home at the last, not from a sickbed, but from a celebration. Her long work crowned with the plain human joy of a birth, come safely and fully through. Let us turn now to the small white cloth, called the chrisom. Among the objects of the child's early days was the chrisom, a small white cloth placed upon the newborn at its baptism, laid over the head that had been anointed with holy oil. The child wore this white cloth in the weeks that followed, and it carried a tender and a solemn significance. Should the child die within its first month, before the mother's own churching, it was buried in this very cloth, and such an infant was known, in the gentle and sorrowful phrase of the age, as a chrisom child. The chrisom bound the child's brief days to the sacred, the white cloth a sign of the baptismal grace it had received, worn close through the fragile early weeks when a newborn's hold on life was least sure. That the same cloth should serve, if the worst came. As the little one's shroud gave it a poignancy that the age felt keenly, the symbol of the child's welcome into the faith becoming, if need be, the wrapping in which it was returned to God. Offerings of such cloths and other gifts were made at the churching in the ordinary and happier case. We touch here, softly, on the sorrow that shadowed even the gladdest births, for infant death was a constant presence in that world, and the chrisom cloth held both the hope and the fear of it in its small white folds. But in the great majority of cases the cloth was simply part of the joyful business of a new Christian life, laid on a living, thriving child, and remembered afterward among the keepsakes of its earliest days. We will come to the sadder side more fully later, and gently. For now the cloth is white with welcome. Let us turn now to the wet nurse and the feeding of children not one's own. Not every mother nursed her own child, and where she could not, or in some circles would not, her place at the breast was taken by another woman, the wet nurse, hired to give her milk to a child not her own. A mother might be unable to nurse through illness, through the failure of her own milk, or because she had died in or after her childbed, and among the wealthy, it was often simply the custom that a hired nurse, rather than the lady herself, should suckle the child. The wet nurse was thus a familiar figure across the whole span of society, from the great house to the foundling's care. Her work was among the most intimate that one household could hire from another, for she gave of her own body to sustain a child through its most vulnerable months, and a good and reliable nurse was valued and sought after accordingly. She might take the child into her own home, or come to live in the household that employed her, and the bond formed between a nurse and her charge could be a deep and lasting one. The woman who suckled a child remembered by it, sometimes with real affection for the whole of its life. The reliance on wet nurses reminds us how communal the raising of children could be, how the feeding of the young, like their birthing, drew on a wider circle than the single mother alone. In a world where a mother's death or a failure of milk could otherwise doom an infant, the wet nurse was a genuine lifeline, and the network of women willing to give their milk was, quietly, one more of the many ways that the community closed ranks to keep its most fragile members alive. Let us turn now to how such a nurse was chosen. The choosing of a wet nurse was undertaken with great care, for it was believed that far more than mere nourishment passed to a child through the milk it drank. The nurse's own health and cleanliness were weighed, and her age, and the freshness of her milk, but so too, and very seriously, was her character. For the old understanding held that the qualities of the nurse, her temperament, her habits, even her moral nature, were carried into the child along with her milk. A calm, healthy, good-natured nurse was sought, and a woman of ill temper or poor character avoided, lest her failings pass into the child at the breast. Her diet, too, was watched and guided, for what the nurse ate and drank was thought to shape the milk, and so the child, and she might be counselled toward wholesome, moderate fare, and away from anything believed to sour or trouble her milk. The whole of her life, in a sense, came under a gentle scrutiny, because the whole of it was thought to reach the child through her nursing. To choose a nurse was to choose, in the belief of the age, a second source of the child's very nature. This belief that character travelled in the milk gave the choosing a weight that went well beyond the practical, and it shows us how deeply the age held that a child was shaped by those who tended it in its earliest days, whether or not temperament passed in the milk. The care taken to find a good and wholesome nurse reflected a real and tender concern for the child's whole formation, body and nature together, from its very first months of life. The nurse was chosen, in the end, as a kind of second mother, and weighed as carefully as one. Let us turn now to the herbs that were used to bring in the milk. Whether for the mother herself or for a hired nurse, a good and plentiful flow of milk was a matter of real concern, and the old medicine had its herbs to encourage it. Fennel and dill, aniseed and caraway, and above all fenugreek were reached for, brewed into teas or taken in the food, long trusted to increase and enrich a nursing woman's milk. Barley water and certain gentle broths were given to the same end, and lettuce and other cooling green things were recommended in some traditions. The whole small pharmacopoeia of the nursing mother aimed at keeping her milk flowing full and sweet. These milk-bringing herbs were among the most benign of all the women's remedies, gentle kitchen plants for the most part, as much food as medicine, and they were taken freely and without the caution that the stronger birth herbs required. A nursing mother troubled by a thin or failing flow would be counselled toward them by the older women about her, and they became part of the ordinary domestic law of feeding a child, passed from mother to daughter along with everything else. That so many of these herbs are the mild, familiar plants of the kitchen and the dooryard is fitting, for the nursing of a child was the gentlest and most domestic phase of the whole long business of childbearing, and its medicine matched its mood. Where the birth chamber had reached for potent and carefully measured herbs, the nursery reached for fennel and dill, the soft green helpers of the everyday, trusted to keep a mother's milk in generous flow and her child, in turn, well fed and thriving. Let us turn now to the feeding of a child by hand, with pap and the early vessels, where a mother's milk failed and no nurse could be found, or to supplement what the breast gave. A child might be fed by hand with pap, a soft mixture of bread or flour cooked up with milk or water, sometimes sweetened, spooned or coaxed into the infant a little at a time. A thicker version, enriched with broth, went by the name of panada, and these soft foods were the medieval answer to a child that could not, for whatever reason, be sufficiently suckled. They were fed by spoon by a fingertip, or by cloth soaked and offered for the child to suck, and later by simple feeding vessels made for the purpose. Such vessels were among the humble tools of early childhood, small pots or horns fitted with a piece of cloth or a pierced end through which a child could draw the pap, the distant ancestors of later feeding bottles. They were an imperfect help at best, for hand feeding a young infant was far more perilous than nursing, the food less suited to it and less clean, and a child raised by pap alone fared, more often than not, less well than one at a mother's or a nurse's breast. The women who tended such children did the best they could with what they had. Hand feeding was, in truth, a measure of last resort, reached for when the natural way had failed, and its risks were felt if not fully understood. That the old world developed its paps and its little horns at all speaks to the determination to keep even the most disadvantaged infants alive. The child whose mother had died, the foundling, the babe whose nurse could not be got. It was a frail lifeline, but it was a lifeline, and gentle hands offered it, spoonful by patient spoonful, to children who had no other. Let us turn now to the weaning of the child from the breast. In time, every nursed child came to its weaning, the gradual leaving of the breast for ordinary food, and this too was governed by custom and by care. Children were often nursed far longer than is now usual, frequently well into their second year, and sometimes beyond, and the weaning, when it came, was managed by degrees. The child led slowly from milk toward the soft foods, and then the plainer fare of the household. The coming of the teeth was often taken as a natural sign that the time drew near. To discourage a reluctant child from the breast, mothers and nurses sometimes resorted to small stratagems, dabbing the breast with something bitter, a little aloes or wormwood, so that the child, meeting an unpleasant taste, turned of its own accord to other food. The timing of weaning was chosen with thought, avoided when a child was sick or a season harsh, and in some places tied to the moon or to favorable signs, for it was held that a child weaned at an ill-chosen time might thrive less well. It was a small passage, but a real one, and it was not undertaken carelessly. Weaning marked the end of the child's earliest and most dependent phase, its first real step from the total reliance of the newborn toward the slow independence of the growing child. The mother or nurse who had suckled it now guided it, gently and by stages, into the wider world of ordinary food and ordinary life, and the bond of the breast, which had sustained the child through its most fragile months, was loosed at last, in its own good time, with the same patient care that had first established it. Let us turn now to the beliefs that gathered about milk itself. Milk, like so much of the body's mysteries, drew to itself a whole cloud of belief and lore. It was widely held that the mother's or the nurse's diet passed directly into the milk, and so into the child, and that a nursing woman must therefore eat wholesome, temperate food, and avoid whatever was thought to sour or trouble her flow. Strong drink, over-rich fare, and violent emotions were all believed to reach the child through the milk, and a nursing woman was counseled toward calm and moderation for the infant's sake as much as her own. The timing of things about the milk was often tied, as so much else was, to the moon and to the signs, the weaning chosen by an auspicious phase, the flow itself thought to wax and wane with larger rhythms. A nursing woman moved within a web of such beliefs, each meant to protect the precious business of feeding her child, and the older women about her were ready with counsel drawn from the same deep well of custom that governed birth and gathering and every other quiet work of women's hands. Little of it was written, and all of it was passed mouth to ear along the familiar female channels. Whatever the truth in these beliefs, and some, like the care over the nurse's diet, held more sense than others, they show a world attending closely and tenderly to the feeding of its young, surrounding it with care and caution and watchful custom. Milk was life to an infant, plainly and absolutely, and the age treated it so, hedging its giving about with every protection belief could offer, and trusting the whole delicate business to the accumulated wisdom of the women who had nursed the generations before. Let us turn now gently to the bonds and the risks of nursing away from home. The relationship between a nurse and the child she fed could grow into a deep and tender bond, the woman who suckled a child becoming, in effect, a second mother to it, and remembered so, at times, with lasting affection. Yet the practice carried its shadows too, especially among the great, where a highborn child was often sent away from its own home to be nursed in the country, in the household of the nurse, sometimes for a year or more. This sending away, however customary, meant a separation of mother and child at the very start of life, and it carried real risks. An infant sent to a distant nurse was beyond its own family's daily eye, and its fate rested wholly on the character and the care of the woman it had been given to, and on the plain fortunes of health in a strange household. The mortality of such sent away children could run higher than that of children kept at home, and the custom, for all its convenience to the great, was not without its griefs. A mother might see little of her child through its most fragile year, and might, at the worst, receive back only sorrowful news. We touch here on the edge of the sadness that ran through even the tender business of nursing, for the raising of children in that world was shadowed always by how easily they might be lost. The bonds formed at the breast were real and deep, and so, too, was the grief when they were broken, whether by the ordinary partings of weaning and growing, or by the harder partings that came too often and too soon. It brings us softly toward the sorrows that no herb and no charm could turn aside, which we will hold now, briefly and with care. Let us turn now, quietly, to the losses that the whole of this world lived alongside. We would not tell the truth of the medieval birth chamber if we passed over in silence how often it knew grief. Mothers died in childbed, and children died newborn, or in their first fragile weeks and months, in numbers that a modern listener finds hard to hold, and every midwife, across her long working life, met these losses again and again. They were woven into the whole fabric of the work, the shadow that lay always at the edge of even the happiest birth, and the women of that world carried them with a hard, earned, unflinching gentleness. The midwife stood at the center of both the joy and the sorrow. She who caught the living child was also often the one who tended the mother who did not survive, or who washed and wrapped the child that did not live, moving between cradle and grave sometimes within a single night. That she could bear this again and again, and return the next time with steady hands, speaks to a quiet strength that ran through the whole of her calling, a capacity to face the worst, and still to keep coming when called. We hold these sorrows calmly, as they must be held, without either turning away from them or dwelling in them. They were real, and they were common, and they were borne by whole communities of women who knew grief intimately and met it with care rather than despair. To honor the midwife's world truly is to acknowledge its griefs alongside its comforts, and to feel, through them, the depth of the courage and the tenderness that the ordinary women of that age brought to the oldest and most perilous work there is. Let us turn now to the particular sorrow of the child who died unbaptized. Among the sharpest of the age's griefs was the fear for a child who died before it could be baptized, for the faith of the time taught that such a soul was shut out from heaven, and this belief lent a terrible urgency to the baptizing of a weak newborn. It was the very reason the midwife was empowered to baptize a dying child herself, a mercy meant to spare both the infant's soul and the parent's anguish. And she carried the weight of it into every birth, where the child came frail into the world. Where a child died unbaptized despite all haste, the sorrow was compounded by the fear for its soul, and the age sought what comfort it could. Folk belief softened the harsh doctrine in 100 tender local ways, with quiet hopes and customs that imagined some gentler fate for the innocent lost. And the emergency baptism the midwife could give stood as the Church's own mercy against the fear. Much of the anxious care around the newborn's first moments flowed from exactly this, the longing to see even the briefest life safely marked as belonging to God. It is a sorrow not easy for the modern mind to enter fully, resting as it did on beliefs many no longer share, but the human grief beneath it needs no translation. Parents feared for their lost children and reached for every comfort and every hope they could find, and the midwife's small sacred power to baptize was, among all her gifts, perhaps the one most freighted with love and dread together. We leave it gently, with a thought for all the comfort the old customs tried, in their way, to give. Let us turn now to the midwife as the keeper of both thresholds once more. We spoke at the very beginning of our evening of how the woman who brought children into the world was so often also the one who prepared the dead to leave it, and here, at the sorrowful edge of her work, that double role showed itself most fully. When a mother or a child was lost, it was frequently the same midwife, the very hands that would have caught the living child, who now washed and wrapped the body for its burial, tending in death the ones she had hoped to tend in life. She held both ends of the passage, the coming and the going alike. There is a hard completeness in this that carries its own strange comfort. The person who understood most deeply the fragile miracle of birth was also the one who tended its failures, and she brought to the laying out of a lost mother or a lost child the same knowing gentleness she brought to a living one. The community's griefs, like its joys, passed through her steady, experienced hands, and she wore the double burden without flinching, the keeper of the village's thresholds in sorrow as in gladness. That the same woman stood at cradle and at grave gave a wholeness to the community's care that we might now find deeply moving. Birth and death were not handed to strangers, but tended by one trusted, familiar figure who knew the family, who had perhaps caught the very mother now being buried, and who would, in time, catch her daughter's children too. She was the thread that ran through all of it, the constant human presence at every crossing of the great thresholds in a single long life given to the tending of both. Let us turn now to the small keepsakes the grieving kept. Against their losses, the families of that world kept what small tokens of memory they could. A lock of a lost child's hair, the little chrisom cloth in which it had been baptized, and if it died, was buried, some small worn thing it had touched. These were treasured and kept, quiet anchors of memory in a world that lost so many of its young. The grief of a mother or a family did not vanish because loss was common. It was carried, privately and long, and these humble keepsakes were among the ways it was held. The community remembered too, in its own quiet fashion, and the customs of mourning, however plain, gave the sorrow a shape and a place. The midwife who had tended both the birth and the loss was part of this remembering, one who had been there and who carried, in her own long memory, the knowledge of each small life she had caught and each she had been unable to keep. Nothing was quite forgotten, even when little was written, and the losses lived on in the soft, unwritten memory of the women who had witnessed them. We linger here only a moment, and then we will turn back toward the light, for our evening is nearly at its close, and the sorrows, though real, are not where we mean to leave it. But it is right to have held them gently for a little while, and to have honored, in passing, the grief that ran always beneath the surface of this tender work, and the small brave keepsakes by which love outlasted, quietly, even the losses it could not prevent. Let us turn now toward how any of this reached us at all, beginning with the records that survive. For a body of knowledge held so largely in memory, and practiced by women so rarely written of, it is a wonder that we know as much as we do, and what we know we owe to a scattering of surviving records. The church registers of licenses and the books of oaths preserved the names of midwives who would otherwise have vanished entirely, and here and there a woman is named in a testimonial, a court record, a parish account, given back to us across the centuries by the plain fact that someone wrote her down. The great majority remain anonymous. An unnumbered multitude of skilled women known, now only in the aggregate, but a precious few reach us by name. These records, dry as many of them are the thin thread by which the whole world we have described tonight is tied to solid ground. Through them we can be sure that these women lived, that they were licensed and trusted and sworn, that they attended the births and gave the testimony and baptized the dying, that the customs were real and widespread, and not merely imagined. Every named midwife in a mouldering register stands, in a sense, for the thousands of her unnamed sisters, and lets us say with confidence that this was a real calling, held by real women across the whole of the medieval world. It is worth a moment's gratitude at the close for those few dry records, and for the later hands that read and gathered and preserved them. Without them, this whole rich world would be far mistier than it is, a matter of guess more than of knowledge. Because of them, we can sit here tonight and speak of it with some assurance, and give these long-forgotten women at least the small honor of being remembered, and their patient, skillful, courageous work the acknowledgement it was so rarely given in its own time. Let us turn now to the slow moment when the tradition began to write itself down. For most of the Middle Ages, the knowledge of the birth chamber lived in women's memory and passed by women's voices and the books about it. When they came, were mostly written by men who had never entered that room. But in the centuries that followed, slowly, this began to change, and the tradition started, at last, to write itself down in its own hand. In France, a celebrated royal midwife set down her long experience in print, and later in England, a midwife published a book of her own, addressed to her fellow midwives. The first such work in the language written by a woman who had actually done the work. These books mark the far horizon of our story, the point at which the long oral tradition of the birth chamber began to find its own written voice, women setting down for other women the knowledge that had, until then, always been spoken rather than penned. They came after the medieval centuries we have dwelt in tonight, but they grew directly from them, from the same accumulated wisdom, handed down mother to daughter, that we have followed through this whole long evening. In their pages at last, the village midwife's ancient knowledge found a keeper that could not be lost to failing memory. There is a quiet satisfaction in reaching this far shore of the story, in knowing that the knowledge did not, in the end, simply vanish with the women who held it, but found, however late, its way onto the page in its own true voice. The unlettered midwife of the medieval cottage never wrote a word, but her knowledge outlived her, carried down the generations until, at last, a daughter of her tradition could read and write, and set it all down, and so hand it forward to us. Let us turn now, at the very last, to what survived of all of it. When we look for what remains of this whole vast, quiet body of knowledge, we find that a surprising amount of it never truly disappeared at all, but flowed on, changed and continued, into the practice of the centuries that came after and even into our own. Midwifery itself endured unbroken. Women attending women through birth in a line that stretches from those medieval chambers to the present day. Some of the very herbs survived with it. Raspberry leaf still trusted, and still taken, still handed from woman to woman, with much the same words attached, a living thread reaching back 1,000 years. The deeper things survived too, beneath the changing methods. The gathering of women about a birth, the value of a calm and experienced presence, the honoring of the mother with rest and care afterward, the tenderness of the first attentions given to a newborn. These were not medieval inventions but human ones, and they outlasted the particular world that we have visited tonight, carried forward, because they answered needs that do not change. The girdles and the eagle stones fell away, but the held hand and the warm room and the patient, knowing woman remained. So the knowledge was not lost, only transformed, its truest parts kept and its passing beliefs let gently go. The medieval midwife, unnamed and unlettered, stands at the head of a line that has never quite been broken, and something of her patient, courageous, tender craft lives on wherever a woman is still helped, with care and calm and knowing hands, through the oldest and most hopeful passage there is. That continuity, quiet and unbroken, is perhaps the gentlest fact of all to carry with us as our evening draws to its close. We have wandered a very long way tonight, from the woman herself, and the many names her neighbors gave her, through her learning and her oath, into the warm sealed chamber and the circle of women who filled it, past the herbs of the birth stool and the girdles and the whispered prayers, through the long night and the first care of the newborn, the sheltered lying, in and the churching that closed it, the milk and the nursing and the sorrows that no charm could turn aside, and at last to the thin thread of names and books, by which the whole of it reached us. 100 quiet facts, gathered a small handful at a time, about the oldest and most tender of all the healing arts. There is nothing left to remember, and nothing left to do. The fire in the chamber has settled to its last soft embers. The candle has burned down to its final patient inch, and the women have long since gone quietly home through the dark. The mother sleeps, and her child sleeps beside her, safely come at last into the world. And the room that held so much effort and hope and fear has gone entirely still. Let us allow ourselves that same stillness now. If your eyes closed somewhere along the way tonight, that was always the whole point of the evening, and there is nothing at all to have missed. The facts will keep. The candle will keep. All of it will be here again, whenever you should wish to return to it. Sleep well. The quiet apothecary will be back soon with another quiet chapter. For now there is only this. The low, steady dark, the last of the embers fading softly to grey, and the whole of a long night ahead of you, unhurried, undisturbed, and entirely your own. Rest now, and let it all grow quiet, and let yourself drift gently down into sleep.